very happy birthday to Miss Norman Den. I think this is probably not the way you imagine spending your birthday, but we're very happy to be in your presence today, and we hope your day goes well. Welcome to meeting number 13 of the House of Commons, the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Pursuant to the order of reference on Tuesday, April 11th, the committee is meeting to discuss the parliamentary duties in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we start, I want to inform members that pursuant to the order of reference, the committee is meeting for two reasons. Number one, for the purpose of undertaking a study and receiving evidence concerning matters related to the conduct of parliamentary duties in the context of COVID-19. Number two, to prepare and present a report to the House of Commons by May 15th on the said study. The order of reference also stipulates that only motions needed to determine witnesses and motions related to the adoption of the report are in order. Today's meeting is taking place by video conference, and the proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. So you are aware, the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee as you see it on your Zoom screen right now. So that's the online screening that people can stream and watch. It will just be focused on the speaker when they are speaking. In order to facilitate the work of our interpreters and ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules. This is mainly for the benefit of the new witnesses that we have before us today, although we know that you're probably well versed with procedural rules such as these and etiquette for these meetings. Number one, interpretation in this video conference will work very much like in a regular committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. I will state here that we have noticed it is best, if possible, to remain speaking in one language and select that language at the bottom of your screen. If you are going to switch from one language to another, please also pause in between and switch that language at the bottom of your screen. Remaining on floor language sometimes has caused some difficulties. Number two, before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, you can either click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, or you can hold down the space bar while you are speaking. When you release the space bar, your mic will mute itself just like a walkie-talkie. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. Should the members need to request the floor outside of their designated time for questions, they should activate their mic and state that they have a point of order. If a member wishes to intervene on the point of order that has been raised by another member, you should use the raised hand function. This will signal to the chair of your interest to speak. In order to do so, you should click on participants at the bottom of your screen, and when the list pops up, please click the icon that says raise hand. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. Using your headsets is strongly encouraged. Should any technical challenges arise, for example, in relation to interpretation, or any problem with your audio arises, please advise me immediately, and the technical team will work to resolve your problem. Please note that we may need to suspend during these times as we want to ensure that all members can participate fully. Before we get started, can everyone click on their screen in the top right-hand corner and ensure that they are on gallery view? This view should enable you to see all participants in a grid view. It will ensure that participants can see one another. During this meeting, we will follow the same rules that usually apply to opening statements and the questioning of witnesses during our regular meetings. Per the routine motions of the committee, each witness has up to 10 minutes for an opening statement, followed by the usual round of questions from members. Just as we usually would in a regular committee meeting, we will suspend between panels in order to allow the first group of witnesses to depart and the next panel to join the meeting. I'd like to welcome our witnesses here today. We have with us Matthew Hamlin, from the Strategic Director of the Chamber Business Team from the House of Commons of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We have Swan Davies, from the National Assembly of Wales, and we have Ian McCowan from the Privy Council Office, and we have from Scottish Parliament 2 witnesses, David McGill and Bill Ward. Welcome to you all, and we will start with Mr. Hamlin for your 10-minute opening statement, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to you and our members of the committee for this invitation to give evidence to your committee on a subject which is occupying all of my time at the moment. I see I've been asked to speak for up to 10 minutes. I don't think I've got 10 minutes worth of material. You'll be very glad to know, given you have a lot of witnesses to get through.
That would be great. I would like to highly encourage all the witnesses at this point, if you can keep your statements brief, please do so, because there are so many questions that everyone wants to get to. Thank you.
That greatly suits me, because I don't have a prepared presentation apart from what I've written in the last 15 minutes during the sound checks. So it might be helpful to explain what I do, what I'm doing in this context, and then talk the committee through very briefly what we've done in the last 4 weeks, which has probably been the biggest set of changes to how the House of Commons works in the last 700 years. So I was asked by the Clerk of the House, John Benger, to coordinate all the different work streams that are going on to deliver what we're loosely calling virtual parliament. That's across the work of our select committees, the chamber, coming on stream, electronic remote voting, and then beyond that, the virtual legislation committees, which in our system are different from our policy-based select committees. So that's quite a lot of work. We've also had to liaise closely with our colleagues in the House of Lords, as we have a shared parliamentary digital service, and we have a shared broadcasting service who support both houses. So those two teams have been under particular pressure in the last few weeks. So what happened? So right just before our Easter recess, so late March, the House passed a motion allowing for select committees to meet virtually, that is to allow participation by electronic means under the authority of the Speaker. And the first virtual select committee took place, I think, 2 or 3 days after that, appropriately enough it was the Health Select Committee talking about the coronavirus with the Health Secretary. So over the Easter recess, which was slightly longer than usual because of the pandemic, we had an increasing number of virtual select committee meetings. In parallel, the Speaker wrote to the Clerk of the House on the 31st of March, asking him to ensure that by the time the House returned on the 21st of April, we had arrangements in place to allow remote participation in questions to ministers and for statements by ministers in the House, on the basis that members could participate either physically or virtually, which is why we are calling this a hybrid model or hybrid proceedings. So we worked exceptionally fast to work out whether this was possible, what was possible, and then to deliver it. We also worked in parallel with the government, the Leader of the House, and the party managers to ensure consensus with what we were proposing, and the Speaker played a very active role in doing that. We had to agree the procedural motions that were required to enable all this to happen. So on our first day back on the 21st of April, by special agreement with the Speaker, we chucked out that day's business and just agreed motions moved without notice to enable what we call hybrid scrutiny proceedings to take place the next day. The next day, on the 22nd of April, so still not very long ago, like last week, I think it must be now, we had our first virtual question time and virtual Prime Minister's question time. We then immediately passed motions to extend this hybrid model further to other classes of business, including legislation. And we also agreed in principle to electronic remote voting, so members would not need to come to Westminster to vote. So we've now had 4 of our what we call hybrid chamber days. We've had the second readings of 3 bills on 3 days this week. One of the things I'd like to mention at this point in particular, thinking about the 4 headings I've written down, we've done everything in incredible speed And that's been a real challenge for the House service and the digital service, which we've risen to. I would say this magnificently, but the Speaker and everyone else has said the same thing. We've learned very fast completely new ways of doing things, and this is supported by large numbers of staff working remotely from their front rooms and rooms like we're sitting in now, but it also required a lot of staff still to come to the Palace of Westminster to work in the broadcasting studios, in the chamber, because we have physical participation, and to some extent in committee rooms. So it still does mean we have a lot of colleagues who have to come and work in the building. We've had to be very frank with members about what is deliverable, both due to technical capacity, due to the human resource capacity of how long you can keep people being set up. You have seen how much time colleagues did on the setup for this committee meeting. We're having to do that for maybe 60 members at a time for a full day's proceedings, and that's quite a large staff undertaking. The other thing we've done is adapt practices. So we've dropped large classes of business from our agenda for now, and we have dropped, for technical reasons, a lot of the traditional ways in which we do business. So there are no interventions in speeches. We have published lists of speakers, so everyone knows who is coming next, so the broadcasters know who to queue in, and we know who is speaking virtually or physically. We've set much longer deadlines for members wishing to participate in proceedings, because we need to do all the planning and making sure their connections work and all the rest of it. So that's made a very big change to the feel of how things work. And it is also weird, I have to say, just sitting at the table of the House in a chamber built for 400 people with 20 members present, but with the members speaking beaming down at you from 8 large screens suspended from the galleries. I'm now wearing headphones at the table of the House, as is the Speaker's secretary. So we stay in touch with the broadcasting team who are in a different building. It's been a really big, I mean, I can't underestimate how big the cultural, technical, political change has been. The things I would say are essential are consensus among the parties about what's happening and an agreement on what is doable, an agreement among the political parties on how we extend and build going forward so we can do more of this for the medium term, I guess. But also really strong and effective leadership of the staff involved to ensure that we as very senior managers, leaders in the organisation, can have those frank conversations with members about what we can and can't do, but also can ensure we support and motivate our staff to keep on delivering this more or less impossible stuff. The next big challenge will be electronic remote voting. Literally, as I speak, we are doing the first live test with several hundred members of Parliament. And that planning for that has been, well, it's been interesting, I would say. But I'm very happy to stop there and answer further questions.
Thank you so much. Next up, we have Mr. Davies, please.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Madam Davies.
That's okay. So good afternoon from Wales, where the Senedd has been continuing to meet virtually since we've had the lockdown here in the UK. So I'd like to just talk briefly about how we've made changes and to sort of structure my talking under 4 headings: the political will that was required to have the Senedd continue to meet during these times, the procedural ability to do so, so the changes that we made and those changes that we did not need to make, how we got it up and running, and how we will keep it up. And a lot of the points that Matthew's raised are pertinent also to our experiences here in Wales. So first up, where there's a political will, there's a way. Our Llywydd Speaker and the First Minister in Wales were determined that the Senedd would continue to meet during the COVID-19 emergency. So they decided that we would suspend our planned Easter recess and that the Senedd would continue to meet. That was for 2 reasons: that the nature of the devolution settlement in Wales is such that at times like these, the Assembly in Wales and other legislatures in the UK had agreed that certain powers would be taken at the United Kingdom level for coordination across the UK. And that led to an unprecedented situation where UK Parliament was legislating straight for Welsh ministers to have powers to make subordinate legislation that would not necessarily require the approval of the Assembly. So this was something that the First Minister and the Llywydd were very keen that the Senedd could continue to meet to look into how that was going to happen in operation. There was cross-party support for a continuation, so no members were objecting to this on the grounds of public health. And we had an agreement to a smaller emergency Senedd by political agreement, a smaller number of members to come together to meet to continue business. So this was all premised on physical meeting prior to the lockdown in the United Kingdom. So we indeed had a meeting of the Senedd in a smaller form, and at that time we agreed a raft of emergency standing orders to enable the continuity of business of the Senedd going forward. They included new recall provisions where the Llywydd could recall the Assembly. Hitherto it had been the First Minister that could recall the Assembly. A reduced quorum, so the quorum of 60 members usually is 10, and we reduced the quorum to 4, enabling there to be business continuity in an extreme scenario.
If I may, I feel very bad for interrupting you, but if you could slow down just a little bit for the benefit of our...
So we also introduced weighted voting. Previously, there was no ability for any form of proxy voting, so we introduced the ability for block voting by groups of parties or individuals casting their own votes. We also had a restriction of public access to the building when it was open, and this enabled us to go online also later on, and agreed to relax some of the requirements in standing orders for questions to be taken on a weekly basis. Also a provision for the functions of the legislation committee to be undertaken by the whole Assembly if that was necessary. And we finally had provisions to elect a temporary presiding officer or a temporary chair of the proceedings in the event that the Speaker or the Deputy were unavailable. So those provisions were agreed, and that was all premised on physical meeting. Post-lockdown, the Business Committee was keen that the Senedd continued to meet in virtual form, and there was no requirement for us to change our standing orders. The statute and standing orders here in Wales do not require any physical presence for meeting. There is no specification of a place of meeting, and there is no requirement for members to be present. Rather, they are required to participate. So we didn't need any additional provision for virtual meetings. The only requirement that we had that sort of determined the practicality of certain mechanisms for virtual meeting was our statutory requirement to have bilingual proceedings, Welsh and English, which is similar to the situation that you have for the need for translation. And therefore, we were able to continue to meet as a Senedd post-lockdown by turning to a virtual platform, and we used, as you are now, Zoom. So we've had 4 meetings of the virtual Senedd. The first was on the 1st of April. We were the first UK legislature to have virtual plenary proceedings. We've had subsequently 4 meetings virtually of the plenary, 1 per week, and increasingly increasing the number of members who are participating. The first meeting was recorded, subsequent meetings have been live. We've had voting online from the second meeting, and we had another vote yesterday by weighted voting. And we've had various interesting procedural and other issues arise along the way. So we've been learning as we've been going. We've had virtual committees starting to meet from this week, where we have had meetings of the health, education, economy and legislation committees. So we're currently running a timetable of 2 committees on Tuesday, 2 on Thursday, and the virtual plenary meetings on Wednesdays. I guess that what enabled us to get it up and running, in addition to the lack of a procedural prohibition on meeting virtually, was the fact that we're a young institution. We're a small institution. We're unicameral, so that means that we're young. So when members and staff are used to working electronically in an electronic chamber, they're used to electronic committee meetings. We're small, and therefore, in contrast to Matthew's contribution, it is feasible for all members to participate, albeit a bit of a challenge. And also we're unicameral, and therefore all of the staff work for the same organisation, the ICT, the broadcasting, the clerks, we all work together. And that, I think, has made it much quicker for us to be able to get up and running. And I suppose it's just a can-do attitude. So on a Friday, the business committee said we'd like to meet virtually next Wednesday, and we just made it happen. Bit of a challenge, but we got on with it. So the challenges, I suppose, were mainly technical rather than political or procedural. There was a political will, there was no procedural barrier, and so it was just a question of making the technology work. So we're using a licensed version of Zoom with the translation capability. So going forward, I think the challenges for us, as for yourselves and other legislatures, are ones of capacity, that once you have a system up and running, there's a demand to try and get all the business up and running again. And as Matthew said, that's just simply not feasible. I think also, as you, Chair, are finding, there are challenges around chairing virtual meetings, around providing advice to virtual meetings when clerks and advisors, are not in the same space as members. And also challenges that we found around maintenance of order in a virtual plenary. There are upsides and downsides to that. And clearly there's behind all of this is the concern that the technology will fail, the internet connections will fail, that the proceedings are kind of at the mercy of external providers to some extent. And I think to finish, the final challenge, I think, for us, and Matthew alluded to this, is that it's a challenge of trying to do business as usual in an unusual way. And so how we can flexibly apply current sort of practices and procedures in the new normal. And then going forward is, how we move back to business as usual when we've had our experience of working online, and whether that indeed leads to an increased appetite for online delivery of assembly business going forward. So that's our experience here in Wales, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. That was very enlightening, and a lot of similarities to some of the of what we've been trying to do for the meantime right now here at Temporarily. Next up is Mr. McCowan, please.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, I never thought I'd get a chance to appear in front of a parliamentary committee from my dining room. There can be no doubt that we're in some interesting times. That said, it's an honor to appear as you try to sort through how best to approach the pandemic. I've been asked to provide some remarks as part of a panel from other jurisdictions, and I'm going to try to fit into that framework by focusing my remarks on three areas. First of all, government business, how it's adapted. Secondly, how Cabinet has adapted. And finally, how parliaments seem to be adapting, particularly ours. So in each of these areas, I'm going to try to draw on what we're seeing in provincial, international experiences. Clearly, different jurisdictions are adopting different approaches suited to their own particular context. That said, comparisons are always helpful, and I'll do my best to sketch out a few which may be of interest. I should say at the outset, all jurisdictions have slightly different parliamentary traditions, and they're in slightly different positions combating the virus, but we're all trying to figure out how to find the best path forward and stay true to our democratic traditions. I should also say finally at the outset that from a governance perspective, it seems clear that all levels of government in Canada come together to collaboratively combat COVID-19. So government operations. Before I turn to Parliament, a couple of comments. They're going to have to be comments of necessity at a high level. The story of the pandemic is still being written, and the governance energy is still focused on managing it. Once we get through the pandemic and the smoke clears a bit, there'll be undoubtedly a chance for the world to look at lessons learned from this extraordinary crisis. In that context, I note that in addition to this committee's examination of the ways and means, the House how the House can meet virtually. There are now, after yesterday, 7 House committees that are authorized to undertake reviews of the effectiveness of government measures to address the pandemic. And in a like manner, the Senate has authorized both the Finance and the Social Affairs Committee to study the implementation of COVID-19.
Mr. McCowan, can we ask you to slow down just a little bit?
Of course, yeah. No
Thank you.
So the Senate has set up their Finance and Social Affairs Committee to study the implementation of COVID-19 measures, and they're also going to have a special committee in the fall to do a retrospective study. Even at this early stage, it is already apparent from a public service perspective that the pandemic has forced an acceleration of some existing trends that we had in government operations. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the use of technology to work remotely. Literally overnight, work groups across government, like most of their private sector peers, have been required to work from home. This acceleration of existing trends is a huge unplanned experiment in teleworking and video conferencing. And it's, of course, too early to determine conclusively the emerging best practices from the experiment, but some early returns from it seem promising, I think. And they have potential implications, not just for continuity planning, but more generally on how government goes about its business day to day. As with a lot of the innovations that are taking place, we're going to have to do lessons learned reviews to see what practitioners feel are the lessons that can be pulled from it, from the new technology. This may be particularly important in terms of organizations with a national footprint who need to be connected regionally, but also, most importantly, to their citizens. On government services, public service has needed to operate in new ways to match the urgency of the crisis in order to get desperately needed supports out the door. That is happening. Governments throughout the world have been challenged to transform their practices in such areas as improving healthcare systems, delivering support, speeding up procurement, engaging the public, securing borders, ramping up coronavirus testing. And there's best practices that are emerging in all of these areas. Some of the best practices will be Canadian, but it'd be myopic if we limited our learning experience to our own borders, even if you add in the very good examples of excellent provincial and municipal innovation in Canada. In the race to speedily identify best practices, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development is an important source of good ideas. As they did following the Great Recession of 2008, the OECD is assessing country practices in response to COVID-19 with a view to identifying best practices to inform government decision-making. They've already developed a country policy tracker that charts the actions of more than 90 nation states to combat COVID-19. In addition, they've developed 12 streams of work to assess country responses for issues such as resilient healthcare, inequalities, social challenges. So this is a good example of the kind of international experience, lessons learned exercise that we're going to be following closely. Cabinet. Approaches to conducting cabinet business have also been agile since the outset of the pandemic, including the need for the Prime Minister to self-isolate in March. Cabinet operations have changed in a number of ways. On March the 4th, the Prime Minister created the Cabinet Committee on the Response to the Coronavirus Disease, or the COVID-19 Committee. This committee is chaired by, as you know, by the Deputy Prime Minister, and it's been very active. Their meeting rate has been higher than the norm for a cabinet committee, in keeping with the nature of the crisis that we're facing. Another important feature from a government's perspective has been the government's extensive use of First Ministers' meetings to ensure a close link and collaboration with the provinces, in addition to innumerable bilateral discussions. This helps to ensure a national integrated response, as different orders of governments have managed to work very successfully together. In terms of full cabinet operations, they've had to rely on technology like all other organizations in society, given both the realities of social distancing and also the challenges that all of you face as being parliamentarians from across the country. Parliament, finally. So for parliaments around the world, many of the same issues are arising. All jurisdictions are trying to think through the implications of COVID-19 for their operations. I'm going to touch on 4 key issues just in terms of what seem to be commonalities across the board. So first of all, reduced sitting times and frequency. Secondly, implementing social distancing. Thirdly, passing emergency legislation. And finally, the use of virtual meetings. So first off, It's interesting to note that most of the legislatures in Canada and around the world responded at the onset of the COVID-19 crisis by adjourning or reducing hours and thereby adhering to the medical guidance. This includes all provincial legislatures that were in session at the time. For those provincial legislatures that were not in session when the virus hit, the Speaker made a determination to adjourn, as what happened in PEI, where the Speaker canceled the spring session. All provincial legislatures stand adjourned. Another common feature of the federal, provincial, and international response has been to consider emergency legislation. As you know, this happened at the federal level with the passing of C-13, C-14. It happened again this week with another bill. It also happened in Alberta with the passing of Bill 10. That was their Public Health Emergency Powers Amendment Act. Passage of emergency legislation has occurred in other provinces, Ontario.
Sorry, you have so much experience and so much to share, and I hate to interrupt, but there is a problem with interpretation being able to hear you clearly right now, and there's probably not much we can do about that, but if you could just slow down, it would really help. Pause at the end of each sentence so that they know they're getting an accurate interpretation.
No problem. I'll slow down. I was just mindful of the precious time limitations, yes. But I will slow down. Okay.
Thank you.
So the passage of emergency legislation has happened, as I mentioned, right across the board, provincially, Ontario, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan. Internationally, you're seeing it in New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom. Give you a couple of points of comparison, other Westminster parliaments. So March 25th in New Zealand, their parliament met with a reduced number of MPs. They received and debated a formal epidemic notice from Prime Minister Ardern, and at that time they passed some COVID response bills. In Australia, a House of Representatives last met on April the 8th. With a reduced but proportional number of representatives. Purpose of the sitting was to pass supply instant bills for COVID-19, and then following the adoption of these measures, the House was adjourned at the call of the Speaker. The Australian Senate met later that day to pass the legislation, and then they too adjourned. So what you're seeing, and this won't be a surprise to committee members, Parliament's doing what they do well, which is in times of crisis, they try to figure out how to adapt and to address matters of public urgency in a timely and an effective way. It's a strong tradition in the Westminster parliaments. The public service has also tried to adapt in its interactions with parliamentarians. A good illustration is the daily call with parliamentarians that's led by the Public Health Agency. Since these calls started on March the 16th, they become an important conduit of information. And just to give you a couple of quick metrics, there's been as many as 226 parliamentarians on that call, an average attendance of about 141 each day, and there have been 91 MPs and senators who've asked questions, and these questions have originated from representatives from every province and 2 territories. Public service effort to support the call has had about 18 departments and agencies involved. So as someone who works in a group focused on governance, it won't surprise you to learn that we're very interested in seeing what responses your committee comes up with respect to the motion the House adopted on April the 11th. The issues that you're grappling with are being faced around the world, and the solutions that you come up with will, frankly, I suspect, be of interest to other jurisdictions. Just a couple more comments. In order to respond to social distancing, there have been sittings of legislatures with reduced but proportional attendance and shortened sessions, often one-day sittings, to deal with emergency legislation. That seems to be the pattern. So legislatures at the provincial level have adopted practices in the zone. BC met on March 23rd to address the crisis past supply. Other provinces which have adopted sitting practices consistent with social distancing, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Ontario, Quebec. Internationally, these practices, you see them all over the place, Finland, France, Germany, the Westminster countries. The continuation of committee business is another point which seems to be a commonality. So virtual meetings like the one we're having right now seems to be a very, very common feature of various legislatures. For example, it's the case in Quebec, case in a number of international jurisdictions, Argentina, Spain, France, Luxembourg, the EU, New Zealand, UK. So Madam Chair, I think I'll leave it there in the interest of time. I apologize for the sound being wobbly, but I am happy to answer any questions, and I'll leave it at that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next up, we have from Scottish Parliament 2 witnesses, David McGill, Clerk and Chief Executive, and then Bill Ward, Head of Broadcasting. I believe, Mr. McGill, you have your opening statement to make.
I do, yes. Thank you, Chair. And I'll maybe ask Bill Ward to say a few words just at the end. So thank you for the invitation to give evidence, and I'm delighted to contribute to this discussion on behalf of the Scottish Parliament. Bill Ward is our Head of Broadcasting Service, and his team has been completely instrumental in enabling us to support the Parliament in continuing to meet during this time, and Bill will be able to answer questions of a technical nature that will be beyond me. Just initially by way of background, so that you can understand the context in which we've been trying to meet these challenges, the Scottish Parliament is, like the Welsh Assembly, a unicameral parliament. We have 129 members. We currently have 19 committees consisting of between 5 and 11 members. And the Parliament normally meets in plenary session on Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday afternoons, with committees meeting those mornings. Voting is normally done in plenary session by electronic means using consoles on each member's desks, and in committees voting is by show of hands. In terms of decision making, the Parliament's House Commission is known as the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body, or SPCB. It's chaired by our Speaker, the Presiding Officer, and has a representative of each of the 5 political parties that we have. On the business side, the Business Committee is called the Parliamentary Bureau. It's also chaired by the Presiding Officer and consists of the party whips. And this is where the majority of the decisions and discussion about when and how, and indeed whether the Parliament and its committees meet during this pandemic have taken place. So turning to our response to the pandemic, public safety measures, including lockdown, were introduced on the 23rd of March by the UK government and were adopted by the Scottish government. And as with other parliaments and organisations, we already had business continuity plans, but we just never imagined that we'd have to implement those on the scale that we subsequently have. So prior to full lockdown, we had taken some early actions such as ceasing parliamentary events, tours, access to the public and so on. And then with lockdown in place, we took the decision to close the building to all but essential maintenance on non-sitting days. And that included those members who used the parliamentary office as their constituency office. And we gave early advice to members about how to go about closing their local offices and how to engage with their constituents remotely. Turning to parliamentary proceedings, our strategy from the outset has been to continue to meet in some form to hold the government to account. The Parliamentary Bureau shared our view that it was more important than ever that our democracy continues to function at this time. So on the 1st of April, the Parliament met physically to consider the emergency legislation that we've just been hearing about, in our case, the Coronavirus Scotland Bill. And this meant having to consider all stages of the legislation in a single day. Because this bill was considered in the chamber, we wanted to observe social distancing arrangements. So we reduced the number of seats available from 129 to 79, and we configured them in such a way so that we met the social distancing requirements. And a proportional share of those 79 seats was given to the parties. That said, the presiding officer was still reluctant to go as far as barring any elected member beyond that who turned up to attend proceedings. So we also made arrangements for voting to take place in the vicinity of the chamber and not just on the seats as normal. As it transpired, we didn't require those extra arrangements because at no point did more than 79 members turn up. So I'm pleased to say that arrangements worked well and the bill was passed that same day. And while we were meeting that day to pass that legislation, we also took the opportunity to elect an additional deputy presiding officer in case any of our other 3 presiding officers couldn't undertake their duties, particularly because one of them was already self-isolating due to her age. So at the same time as we were continuing to stage physical proceedings with reduced members, we continued to work on how the Parliament could hold the government to account without physically meeting. Bill and his team worked round the clock to investigate different platforms and liaised with procedural colleagues on what might work for us. And our International Relations Office also undertook a considerable amount of work identifying what other legislatures were doing. The immediate result of that work was that on the 9th of April, we staged our first Leaders Virtual Question Time, where party leaders had the opportunity to question the First Minister on the Scottish Government's response to the outbreak, all conducted on a video conferencing platform. The session involved a short opening statement from the First Minister on the latest developments before opening to questions from the 4 opposition party leaders. We streamed it live on the Parliament's television service, and the BBC also carried it live, and it was covered in some form by several other broadcasters. So this was our first step, but we recognised that it was limited to party leaders, and other members should also have the opportunity to question the government. So we arranged 2 subsequent sessions the following week, consisting of Leaders Virtual Question Time as the first session and a Members Virtual Question Time as the second session, where up to 20 members had the chance to put questions to 4 different Cabinet Secretaries. I think it's probably important that I say that these virtual question times were informal meetings to allow members some access to ministers. So despite looking and sounding like formal parliamentary proceedings, they weren't governed by our standing orders and therefore don't qualify as formal parliamentary proceedings. That said, our official report, our Hansard, did produce transcripts of these virtual question times, and we published them on our website alongside other official reports of proceedings. We've also now established a specific ad hoc committee to scrutinise the government's response, and that committee held its first virtual meeting on the 23rd of April, so last week. This committee has been established to complement rather than replace the work of other committees which are all keen to continue to meet. So as mentioned, our focus and efforts have been aimed at finding ways of ensuring members can scrutinise the government within the bounds of formal proceedings. Standing order changes now agreed enable formal committee proceedings to take place on a virtual platform and also enable formal virtual meetings of the Parliament. So unlike the Welsh Assembly, our standing orders did restrict where the Parliament could meet. So we had to change our standing orders to allow the Parliament to meet either in its normal debating chamber or in a virtual debating chamber. And we did the same for our committees. For voting, we've also changed references in the standing order from the electronic voting system to an electronic voting system. That's a small but important change because it allows us to adopt any system that can be used remotely. And similarly for committees, we've changed the rules there to make sure that they can operate on any platform that we provide. So bringing you right up to date, on Tuesday of this week, the Parliament met again physically in the chamber. A number of points of order were raised by members about the lack of opportunities to ask questions and also about our plans for remote participation. We recognise these frustrations, and as a consequence, we're increasing the time allocated for questions to the First Minister next week. We're holding additional virtual sessions. We're looking to stage sessions which do allow all members to participate, not just those who are listed to ask a question. We're also expanding the number of virtual committee meetings to meet demand and are planning to test options for remote voting and remote participations in business at Holyrood. So in other words, the hybrid proceedings that have been mentioned earlier as well. So looking ahead, like others, we still have a number of challenges before us. The main ones are how we scrutinise legislation, how we stage online debates, and particularly how we vote. As others have said, that's the biggest challenge that we still have to resolve, and I'll be really interested to hear how the tests that Matthew mentioned earlier go today. Our Parliamentary Bureau has, unlike the Welsh Assembly, rejected block voting quite firmly, and it's currently taking soundings from members on proxy voting. The response so far to that consultation has been mixed, with even many members who are in support of proxy voting qualifying that support by saying that they don't want party whips to have a role in exercising proxies. So we've got some way to go to get a system that can be agreed by members, and that leaves us trying to identify and test a system of remote voting which is secure and allows votes to be conducted quickly and be properly recorded. So, Chair, I'd now like to briefly hand over to Bill, who will say very quickly a few words about the technical approach we've taken, and after that, Bill and I would be more than happy to take questions.
We have very little time, so if you could just maybe take a minute or just about a minute, and
Sure.
then we'll certainly get to you in questions.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Chair. Just to say that really this, like with colleagues, broadcasting colleagues from across the world, it's placed a huge demand on staff. And we had a small department of 9 technicians, and we've had to bring ourselves up to speed very, very quickly. And also find ways of being able to support members to look at their user issues, but then also understand technical issues, connectivity issues and equipment, and how we resolve those problems with members. Our strategy has been to start small as quickly as we possibly could, and using the experience we had on each meeting and then debriefing and then allowing us to scale up week by week. We decided not to use Zoom in consultation with assemblies in Europe. And instead, we've used a combination of a virtual vision mixer platform called vMix, and also another similar video conferencing system called BlueJeans. And I can talk more about this if you find it useful. 2 principles that we've worked on. One is wherever possible, we have kept all operators out of the building and working at home, and all the virtual meetings are operated in this way. And we have a very, very small skeleton staff working in the building when we are actually on premise. The other service that we have felt very important to keep running amongst all this time is the British Sign Language service, and all our key proceedings have been signed virtually. And we've had a lot of feedback from the deaf audience, realizing the importance of keeping them informed at this time. So that's all I'll say now, and I'll take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. So we will begin with our questioning 6-minute round with MP Duncan, please.
Thank you, and thank you to our witnesses for the great information and for joining us. I know you have a lot on your plate, so to make time for us is much appreciated. I want to start with the Welsh Assembly, Ms. Davies, about the interpretation aspect, because we had a good discussion on that last night and are going to be continuing that conversation. So again, just to clarify in the Welsh Assembly that you don't have bi-directional translation, it's from Welsh to English. Could you maybe talk about your staffing requirements for that? And are you having challenges like we're hearing about audio issues, some health and safety issues along that line?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, to confirm that we have translation from Welsh into English. We don't have it from English into Welsh.
Not bi-directional. Yeah.
No, that's right. And therefore, for usual plenary and committees, we would have more than one translator who would swap over, but because we've been trying to keep our plenary sessions limited to a 3-hour slot, we would have one translator performing the role, and the same thing for committees. Therefore, there is, I suppose we've been mindful of the pressure on staff, both in terms of ICT and broadcasting, but also in terms of translation. So we have managed to hitherto accommodate that within our existing staffing, and our translation staff are working from home. Then with regard to the technology, we seem to have made it work. So we're using the Zoom platform and the interpretation as the way that you've got it set up here. I think probably for us, because you only have it going in the one direction, it maybe makes it easier. We did find in initial testing that there was some issues with people not using headsets, where then there was some sort of feedback from translation and the actual sort of non-translated feed, but we resolved that. So thus far, it's worked remarkably well. And the only issues we've identified tended to be user error now, and that's something sort of more generic to the learning the new technology.
Well, thank you. It's good to know that we're not the only ones going through the challenge with that. So thank you, Mr. Ward. I want to pick up on something you you had mentioned about Zoom, and you'd mentioned that you had decided, along with some other European assemblies, not to proceed with Zoom. Could you just elaborate? Is that because of technical capabilities, or is it security concerns? What exactly was the concern? We've had a lot of comments about Zoom. What was your reasoning behind that?
It's mainly around security concerns. There are a number of video conference platforms that offer pretty similar functionality. And it was just felt, I think at the time, there was quite a lot of press going on around concerns around Zoom. Now, our cybersecurity experts said there was no particular increased risk for Zoom than any other platform. They all have similar vulnerabilities, but one of the things was about preempting concerns that members may have had about using this platform at a time that it was receiving quite a lot of adverse press.
Thank you for the information. Mr. Hamlin in the UK. So one of the things I found interesting with the UK Parliament is that the physical setup of the House of Commons actually, with 650 MPs, the physical capabilities of the chamber only allows about 425 members to be in there. So there actually is some restrictions physically in normal times for members to be in the chamber. My understanding from what you're doing now is that there's only a limit of about 120 MPs in the virtual side. Is that a technical or is it a procedural challenge right now of why there is that on the virtual side?
Thanks for that question. The 120 figure is our starting point for what we thought we could most easily manage over the course of a 2.5 hour session. It's a slightly, to be honest, I wouldn't say it's an arbitrary figure, but we had to start from somewhere. And in the average 2 or 3 hours of a House of Commons session, we wouldn't normally get to 120 members. You might do, but it's mainly a technical limitation. And likewise, the limitation of numbers of members physically in the chamber, which is around 50, is based on the physical distancing measures we put in place with signage and blocking off some seating and so on. So they're both driven, in effect, by logistics.
How many days a week is the UK sitting physically in there? Is it 5 days, a couple of days a week, just for context right now?
The House of Commons is sitting 3 days a week, as is the House of Lords. For complicated reasons, we're sitting Monday to Wednesday, and the Lords are sitting Tuesday to Thursday. So we would normally sit 4 days a week and occasionally 5 days a week. So we're also sitting for shorter periods on those sitting days at the moment.
Noted. And just since the physical distancing requirements have been put in place, have things been going okay from a safety perspective? Are you hearing a lot of grievances, or has the physical aspect with the social distancing changes been okay so far?
Certainly in the chamber, the attendance has been very low, even for Prime Minister's questions. And we've had very good cooperation from the party whips. People are sort of behaving themselves. Lots of traditional behaviours, like coming to chat to the clerk at the table or talk to the speaker, people have realised they shouldn't do. We had members had some quite bad publicity towards the end of the session just before the Easter recess, when there were lots of photographs in the media of members clustering around or huddling together, and this clearly was not ideal, and that's now sort of not happening.
Thank you. And just last quick question on voting. You're looking at a technical, and I've seen some UK MPs that I follow on Twitter looking at the testing that's going on as you speak right now. Is there any other options besides the electronic voting that's being considered, pairing, proxy, weighted voting, or is the electronic voting the only method that you're looking at right now?
Obviously, we already have proxy voting available for members on parental leave. So theoretically, one could extend that to other members, say members who are ill for whatever reason. Pairing, we already have. That was an option, but it's not very transparent. If you have sort of 400 members who are apparently not voting at all because they're paired with each other. Weighted voting, no one has suggested to us. So the remote voting is what we've been asked to try and make work. I think the House, our procedure committee will come to a view.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Next, we have Mr. Turnbull, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, everybody, for being here. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to listen to some of the learnings that you've had in other jurisdictions that I think to some degree parallel our parliament here and how it functions. So I've learned a lot already from what you've shared, and I really appreciate your time and you sharing your learning with us. Just to start, I'd like to ask Mrs. Davies. I really appreciated your overview and I think the speed at which the Welsh legislature has moved forward on making quite a few changes. I wondered if you could just maybe list in a brief form what areas and aspects of Parliament have already been quickly adapted to a virtual format.
So I suppose that the main thing is that plenary has continued to meet. So I suppose we took it a different way around to many legislatures where the business committee took a decision that it would continue the business of the plenary in preference to the committees, so that we allocated our resources towards a virtual continuation of the business where the First Minister and ministers could be scrutinised, and where we could continue to pass legislation, the concern being, that we didn't want to establish committees that didn't have the full functionality of the Assembly itself. And I suppose because we're small, we were able to make it happen in a way that perhaps is more of a challenge for larger legislatures. So we have retained the ability for all members to question the executive, and that was the principal sort of driver. Also to just ensure that we could continue to, where it was applicable, continue with the legislative programme of government, and that was of course primarily COVID related. And thirdly, to continue with statutory requirements of the Assembly and to an extent any time critical business. So we foresee in the coming period some matters that are not COVID related that we will need to get through. And so that was our priority. Firstly was to ensure that that could continue. And secondly, committees. Now this week we've started, there was a pressure on the business committee to reactivate, if you like, the committee business. Effectively, the pause we had would have reflected the Easter recess in any case. So we've tried to prioritise those committees that are scrutinising the ministers responsible primarily for the COVID response, and to enable stakeholders to come and assist the committees to undertake that scrutiny function. So I suppose in summary, what we kept going was plenary and scrutiny in relation to COVID and legislative functions.
Thank you for that overview. That's, I really appreciated your opening statement where there's political will, there's a way, and it seems to be true in all cases. I want to ask Mr. McGill a similar question, or a related question about the Scottish Parliament and the changes that have been implemented. It's clear to me that you've been on a path moving closer to being able to, replicate or have formal proceedings again. And you mentioned that there were changes to the standing orders. I wondered if you could go into a little bit more detail as to what specific changes were made or need to be made, and whether agreement has been sought, and how quickly that agreement was achieved by parties. You're on mute, by the way.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah, to take the last part of your question first, we didn't experience a great deal of difficulty in persuading the political parties to agree with what we were planning to do. So that wasn't an issue for us. In relation to standing orders change, we did anticipate that there would be more changes that we would have to make, but we went through our standing orders in a kind of comprehensive review, and we found that there really were only about 3 or 4 different rules that we would have to suspend or vary in order to allow the Parliament to begin to meet virtually and to do things differently. So I think I mentioned the rule that we had that parliamentary meetings take place in the debating chamber in our physical building in Edinburgh. So we had to vary that rule to allow us to meet in a virtual space as well. We don't have any rules about quorums, except for a very, very few minor legislative requirements. So there were no adjustments that had to be made there. And in those regards, where there were requirements for quorums, the political parties were keen that we protected them. They didn't want to go below the numbers that they were statutorily required for particular decision makings. Probably the biggest issue we had was with the length of time that we would make these variations for. Initially, because we were working at high speed, we made these changes, and I think I can quote by saying that we put them through for the duration of the public response to the novel coronavirus COVID-19. But we very quickly realised that it wasn't going to be clear when that public response would come to an end. So we went back again and we adjusted that in line with the emergency legislation and some of the sunset clauses that are in there. So we've now restricted it to sometime during the summer when we'll review it again. But we do give the Parliamentary Bureau and the presiding officer power to extend it rather than having to go back through the process of making the changes in Parliament again.
Thank you. That's all the time we have. Next up, we have Ms. Normandin.
Thank you, and hello to everyone. My first question is for Mr. Hamlin. I'd just like some clarification in case I misunderstood. So you referred to a hybrid parliament. When you say hybrid, do you mean that for a period of time it's virtual and then for a period of time it's in person, or do you mean that both are happening at the same time?
Both are happening at the same time. So the chamber proceedings, in the chamber, members can participate in the same proceeding, either virtually or physically. Our select committees are meeting entirely virtually at the moment, but the chamber is mixed.
Thank you. Then perhaps you could tell me how that hybrid parliament works in terms of speaking turns, logistically. How does it work? Because I think it's a very interesting formula. And perhaps in that way, there's better respect for parliamentary privileges for members.
It means that we have to plan further ahead. So members who wish to take part in a debate or a question period need to let the Speaker's office know much further in advance so we can prepare a fixed speaking list which is published each day, showing all the members who will be called to speak in the order which the Speaker has arranged for them to be called. And that is, we stick to that speaking list, except of course where a member is unobtainable for a technical difficulty, where we may have to take them off the call and insert them in the list later on. So a debate in the chamber will switch between a member who's physically present in the chamber and then a member who is virtual. So it's that kind of mixture. In terms of privilege, it makes no difference at all. We are content that all these are parliamentary proceedings, and any member taking part, whether they're speaking virtually or in the chamber, are covered to the same extent by parliamentary privilege.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. My next question, I believe it would be for Ms. Davies, but if any others would like to add anything, please feel free. From what I understood, some parliaments have expanded sitting times so that they can have actually more sittings. Now, you're saying that you sit once a week. Do you think that's enough? And do members feel that's enough for now for accountability?
For the question. I think to begin with that members were keen to continue proceedings at all. So when other legislatures were not meeting at all and were suspended or adjourned, we continued to meet. Now that it's proved technologically possible and procedurally it works, there is an increased pressure on from members to meet. And as I mentioned earlier, there, as a response, we are now having meetings of committees and plenary, and not just plenary. But I think, as our Llywydd has said when asked, it's not how you would prefer to be conducting things. One would prefer to have all of the proceedings as per usual, but it's as much as we can do to support proceedings at all in the current environment. So I think there will always be a pressure from members to have an increase in business, as there is during normal times. There is pressure from many members for more sittings, and pressure from others maybe for fewer. So, but to answer your question, yes, there is less time being spent on assembly business than there would have been. However, we are perhaps more concentrated and focused on the scrutiny of the government in relation to the COVID-19 and to our legislative functions.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. My next question is for Mr. McCowan. I'd like to ask you about discussions amongst members. It's a little more difficult for unilingual francophones to hear the proceedings, or not the proceedings, but these discussions. And so I'd like to know if, for example, during briefings or meetings, there will be more bilingualism, you feel, as we go along.
I think, obviously, it's a critical aspect going forward that whatever path is found does respect to the country's official languages. In terms of exactly what form that takes, I would defer to the work that your committee is doing. I think the House has quite rightly asked your committee to fashion some suggestions, but the question that you pose, I think, goes to the heart of how the House organizes itself and its business. So I would respectfully defer to the deliberations of your group in terms of how best to address that.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Next up, Ms. Blaney.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. It's amazing that we're meeting together in this way all across the planet. So thank you so much for being here. My first question will go to Mr. Hamlin. One of the things that we've had discussions about, particularly in our meeting yesterday, was how to make sure that when we're meeting in camera virtually, we have that ability to keep protection for our members. I'm just wondering if there's any work you're doing around making sure that in-camera meetings are kept safe and the content of that information kept safe.
Thank you. I think I assume we're talking about in-camera meetings of committees, because our plenary chamber obviously does not meet in camera. It's a really live issue. The strong advice from our Parliamentary Information Authority, who are the people who look after our information security, digital and physical, strongly advised the Speaker and the Lord Speaker that private meetings of committees, or indeed any confidential business, should be conducted using Microsoft Teams, which is regarded as much more secure than some of the other video conferencing systems like Zoom, which is why while we're using Zoom for our broadcasting, we are using Microsoft Teams for private meetings of committees. And that's inconvenient for committees who have to switch between different platforms, between private and public, but that's a very strong advice we have had, and that's been endorsed by the Speaker.
Thank you. And Mr. Hamlin, one of the realities, and you mentioned this in your talk about how all parties are collaborating, and I think here in Canada, all of us can see that there is a sense of collaboration between parties as we negotiate this very challenging time. But one of the concerns that I have is that right now we're in a minority government. And if we were in a majority government, I'm not sure how those rules would roll out in the same way, or how those processes, I should say. So I'm just wondering, when you talk about all parties collaborating, if you could speak to what that looks like and how we could keep safe that collaboration, regardless of if we are in a minority or a majority parliament.
That's a very good question. Obviously, at Westminster, we have a government with a majority of 80, having had quite a long period of minority government. This has meant, obviously, at the end of the day, if the government wanted certain changes to procedure, it could get them just because it is the government who tables the relevant motion, and they could force it through. That's not been their approach. There's been a lot of very thorough consultation between parties. It is noticeable, to give a very live example, the testing, which a colleague mentioned earlier, of our electronic remote voting. We've been doing that. We've been trying to reach out to members to ensure as many as possible take part, and we've been collaborating very closely with the whips of all the main parties to ensure that happens. And they've all been very happy to help, because obviously it's in their interest as whips to make sure that members are able to vote. I think so far it's gone very well. I think we may see difficulties as pressure builds, as I think Siobhan mentioned earlier, as members want more and more business to be done. If we start saying, well, actually, we have a limited capacity, the opposition will say to the government, we would like some opposition time rather than just doing government legislation. And that's where you might start getting the difficulties, and we will be under pressure to make more time available in order to allow a wider range of business. And we'll do that when we know we've got the capacity to do it. But so far, I haven't really seen that happening. There are very good relations, that, as far as I can see, between the leader of the House, who's in charge of parliamentary business as a minister, and his shadow.
Well, thank you so much for that. Mr. McGill, you talked a little bit about having a continuity plan. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that is. One of the discussions that we've had in this committee is making sure that whatever recommendations we're sending really look at how we can adjust to any kind of occurrence that may happen in the future for this. So I'm just wondering, was there a baseline plan that you were able to implement moving forward, or did I mishear you?
No, I don't think you misheard me. We did have existing business continuity plans in line with the standard plans that I think lots of legislatures and other businesses have. Just by outrageous coincidence, there's different aspects to our business continuity plans, different scenarios that might unfold. But the coincidence was that as recently as December, we had rehearsed our response to a pandemic. I have to qualify that by saying in no way did we anticipate just the scale of this pandemic, but the purpose of that exercise was to see how we would descale parliamentary business, how we would identify which of the services that we provide as a parliamentary service were absolutely crucial to the continued ability of the Parliament to meet, and how many staff, what was the absolute minimum number of staff that we needed to deliver those services, and how we would support home working. So those were the things that we had got down to a fair level of detail, which gave us some comfort when we started to respond to the unfolding pandemic. But obviously it's taken us to a scale that we didn't anticipate, so we hadn't rehearsed, hadn't gone as far as rehearsing remote plenary sessions and remote voting and things like that.
Thank you.
Okay, that's all the time we have. We're going to start our second round of questioning, and I was wondering if I could get agreement up front to change the 4 5-minute rounds to 4 minutes each, and then the 2.5-minute rounds to 2 minutes, so that we can get everybody in within this panel. Is that okay? Okay. All right, Mr. Richards, for 4 minutes.
If there's any chance, I have a question, but I know you're tight for time, so I'll just wait and see if there's any chance.
Yeah,
Thank you,
okay, I think the block might be willing to give you their time, so you'll have 2 minutes.
Merci, Christine. Merci mille fois.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Christine.
I'll start with our friends from the UK. I saw a news article yesterday about the House of Lords with your live streams and the online broadcast that was happening, I guess, Wednesday there, where I guess the personal cell phone numbers of a number of the Lords were read out on the live stream that was broadcast as they either joined or left the session, and it forced the proceedings to be halted, I guess. And my understanding was that the intention was to try and get things up and running again for Thursday, which I guess now you could tell us whether that actually did in fact happen. And I understand that then again, I guess next week there's an intention to move over to a sort of more TV quality broadcasting through Zoom. I wonder if you can just give us an update on this, tell us whether that, how this occurred and whether that, what kind of problems that caused and whether the problems have been rectified and now broadcasting has happened again.
I will do my best because obviously I work for the House of Commons rather than the House of Lords, so I don't have all the detail at my fingertips, but obviously maybe through the clerk I can send something in writing afterwards. My understanding is this was a problem that arose from a particular feature on Microsoft Teams, which actually ironically was a security feature. So if you are running an ordinary conference with Microsoft Teams, you can have a feature which announces who is joining the meeting. Normally it would be their name, but if someone has not registered their name, it will read out the phone number of the person who's joining. This had been disabled in the configuration that was being used for the broadcast for reasons to do with where Microsoft puts its systems. I think they'd been moved somewhere overnight, and that change to that feature had been put back to the factory settings, as it were, which didn't become clear until they were actually in session. My understanding is that, apart from anything else, the chief executive of Microsoft has written to the Lord Speaker to apologise. There's been a technical data breach, so the House of Lords, I think, is referring itself to our Information Commissioner. They are switching to using Zoom, the Zoom platform, next week. So that particular issue has gone away, although as a colleague from Scotland, I think, said earlier, all video conferencing platforms probably have some security aspects to them. But the Lords certainly is back on track now, but as of next week, they'll be using exactly the same approach as the Commons.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. McGowan, my understanding from news reports is that Zoom hasn't been approved for any government discussions by the Communications Security Establishment. Yet here we are, of course, with the government having pushed forward for virtual parliament using Zoom. So I'm wondering if you can tell me those things really kind of do seem a little out of sync from my perspective. I wanted to get your perspective on that.
So I should start by telling you I'm not a security expert, and I don't have a good factual basis to respond to your question. But I'd certainly, if it's the will of the committee, I'd certainly be willing to talk to my colleagues in the security area and to get you the latest in terms of the government's perspective on that.
But let me just ask you though, are you aware, that's what I've heard from news reports, is that accurate? Is that what the Communications Security Establishment, I mean, obviously, I understand you're not an expert, but you obviously would rely on this advice. If the Communications Security Establishment is in fact saying it's not approved for government discussions.
That's all the time we have. I wanted to try to Sorry, Mr. McCowan, if you could just briefly answer.
Yeah, so just again, I'm not actually involved in the security determinations in terms of for example, what connectivity is used in various formats. But yes, all the appropriate security agencies of government are involved in that. And if it's useful to the committee, I can get you a quick summary in terms of the latest in terms of Zoom relative to government operations. If that's helpful to the committee, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, if you could provide that, that would be very much appreciated.
Thank you. Next, Madame Petitpas-Taylor, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I want to first of all thank all of our guests, our witnesses, for joining us today. It's great to be able to hear and to learn from your experiences. And also happy birthday to our Bloc colleague before I get going in my questioning. My first question that I wanted to ask, and I'd like to hear from all of our international witnesses, perhaps less from Mr. Hamlin, because we've already heard from you on this matter, but I'm wondering if our international witnesses could comment if they had all-party consensus to move forward with virtual sittings in order to deal with the pandemic and also to properly address physical distancing.
I'm happy to go first to say yes, we did. That our business committee agreed, and our business committee has representation of all the parties on it.
Thank you.
I can quickly add to say it was very much the same in Scotland. We had cross-party consensus from a very early stage, and that was conducted through the Cross-Party Parliamentary Bureau.
Thank you so much for that. Now for Mr. Hamlin, I have a quick question for you. I'm wondering if your parliament is considering passing legislation virtually to allow remote participation from all members.
We don't need to pass legislation to do that because it would be a matter of our own standing orders, and we already have passed a temporary order which allows remote participation in proceedings under arrangements to be made by the Speaker. So that's already in place. The House will have to review those motions because the resolutions expire on the 12th of May. So we have our own sunset clause as well. So we'll need to revisit the resolutions that allow for virtual proceedings quite soon.
Thank you for that, Mr. Hamlin. And another quick question for you as well. Following up on my Bloc colleague's question with respect to the hybrid model, I'm curious to know, was there a reason why that you chose the hybrid model during the question period?
We chose the hybrid model because the Speaker of the House did not feel that he didn't want to be in a position where members are actually forbidden from coming to Westminster. There's a very ancient right that MPs have, and some of them claim, to come to a sitting of the House, wherever it is. And he didn't want to rule that out. So we were asked to devise them. And he also asked us to start with questions and ministerial statements because he felt that accountability of government was the most important thing to start with. We then worked out fairly quickly we could expand it to legislation and other business, but we started with questions to ministers, essentially because that's where the Speaker asked us to start, and we had to start somewhere. But the hybrid model was deliberately there to provide parity for members in person and not in person.
And are you seeing the MPs that are choosing to attend the House? Are they people that are living nearby, or are there are the members of Parliament respecting limiting their travel, I guess?
I've not yet done a really detailed analysis of who's physical and who's virtual. Ministers so far have tended to appear in person, partly because the Speaker has, I think, privately or indeed publicly said it's easier to manage the chamber from his point of view if the minister is there. But we've had a mixture of two ministers answering questions, one virtually, one physically. It helps if the minister has significant technical problems that we have someone in the chamber. But no, some London-based members of Parliament have contributed virtually. Some members have come from a distance to participate physically. But the data is all published now, so people are already looking at it to see what patterns they can see.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have. Next up, we have, is it going to Mr. Tucker or Mr. Brassard?
I believe Mr. Tucker.
Hey, Mr. Tucker, you have 4 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. My comments is around and questions are around the quality of democracy during virtual parliaments, and I'd like to hear the experiences from other parliaments on the concerns of going virtual, as in right now, our question period, being the primary example, is unfortunately going down a path of pre-prepared questions and pre-prepared answers. And it's not per se the questions that are the concerns, it's the answers. Now, if we move to a virtual democracy where people will be responding to questions, I suspect it will be teams of people on other computers drafting other responses versus the minister or actual debate between members. And how do we protect the quality of our democracy? Because the longer we go down this path of having people outside of elected officials control our democracy or influence our democracy behind the scenes, I think is a terrible direction to go for us. And if you look back into Westminster-style democracy, if you look at why we have 3 readings and why it has to be read out loud, it goes back to the belief that it's the member and the individual member, not the team of people behind him, that is helping or directing our democracy. So general comment on that, and if anyone has any questions or responses on that concern, I'd be interested to hear.
Seems like this question is open to everybody.
I might be brave enough to go first and say that from our experience in Wales, albeit the participation is virtual, the members are being asked questions that they didn't know in advance, and the ministers, they're answering themselves, and therefore I think it isn't any different to in the chamber. In our chamber, for example, members all have IT equipment, so that the issues about somebody sending them something would pertain there in any case. So I think thus far our committees and our plenary is not disadvantaged from meeting virtually as opposed to meeting physically. And as someone who's worked in legislatures in Australia and in the UK, I think, the forum in which you meet doesn't necessarily control, what members will do and say and who will direct them. I think that's more of a political question rather than one for us as officials.
If I could maybe offer an observation from Scotland, one of the things that we have noticed is that because some of our question times have been out with the parameters of standing orders, it's meant that the questions are not submitted and published in advance. So the Cabinet Secretaries responding to those questions don't have any idea what is actually going to be asked. It's difficult to say whether that is an improvement in democracy, given that the subject matter is very sombre. So it's difficult to see the politics at play here. It's not a case of opposition members trying to catch government members out or really holding them to account in that kind of real political sense. But it is something that we have noticed in terms of just freeing up and being a bit more flexible in that virtual space that we tend not to be in the physical space.
If I may, Chair, very briefly, I would agree with all of that. We haven't changed any of our rules on the content of questions and answers, so we still have members asking questions, of which the ministers have not had any notice of the substance of the question, so they have to be ready to respond, whether they're virtual or physical. And there's been a lot of discussion about the performance of the new leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, in the last couple of weeks, and people have been watching him at question time, Prime Minister's questions, and noticing, how well he is doing, and they've noticed whether he's physically there or not. But there's been no real, no feeling that the new technology has changed the way the actual politics is working.
Thank you so much. That's all the time we have, and the next questioner is Dr. Duncan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your experience and your wonderful expertise. If I could begin with Ms. Davies, is it correct you have in place remote voting?
We have the ability to vote through our virtual proceedings, but it's not an electronic voting system. It is members voting, weighted voting, and casting the votes on behalf of their party group, and so they are orally being asked, there's a roll call, and they're stating, I'm casting my votes in a certain way. So it is remote and it's virtual, but it's not electronic voting. Whereas in our physical chamber, we have electronic voting.
Thank you. And to Scotland, Mr. McGill, you've changed the standing orders. Might you be willing to table with the committee what you are considering, the options you're considering for remote voting?
Yes, I'd be more than happy to do that. Yeah, it's something that we're hoping to make progress on in the next couple of weeks. So if that would assist the committee, I'm more than happy to do that.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGill. And Mr. Hamlin, I believe you are testing remote voting. Could you talk to us about what remote voting looks like in the UK Parliament, please?
I certainly can. I can tell you what we hope it's going to look like. After this meeting is finished, I will turn on my Twitter feed with a certain amount of trepidation to see how the members got on. Essentially, it is built using systems that our members already have. We have an online system for tabling parliamentary questions and motions. So that's secure, and we know how to run it and how to support it. It simply has a function that, put most simply, when there is a vote, MPs will get a text and an email telling them to check into the Member Hub portal. When they open that, they may have it open already, there will be a banner saying vote now in progress. You click on that and that takes you to a screen telling you what the question is. You click aye or no. You get a second check saying, are you really sure you want to vote aye or no? And you go ahead and click that. You then get a confirmation that you have voted and how you have voted. And we will then take those results and publish them as we do now. So there'll be the usual checks by the House staff. And then once we're content the numbers have worked, they will then be announced by the Speaker and published online. That's the plan anyway. Watch this space.
Thank you, Mr. Hamlin. And would you be willing to table with this committee the procedure and how it has worked, please?
Yes, we've written a lot of guidance and communications for MPs. I hesitate slightly because I'd rather send it to you when we've actually launched the system. So that'll probably not be for another week. But I can send you I can send you straight away via the clerk, what we've already told members about the testing, which gives you a pretty clear idea of what we're planning. And obviously, I'll send you any follow-up once we've actually launched it.
Could I ask one last question around the European Union? Has anyone did you look at the system the European Union used for remote voting?
I don't think we did because we start in a very different place. The European Parliament, like many other parliaments, like most other parliaments that I know of, have a desk for every member in their plenary hall. So members tend to vote from that desk, pressing buttons. We've never had that system. So we started from a completely different place. Obviously.
Sorry, Mr. Hamlin, I meant that for Mr. McGill. My apologies.
I'm so sorry.
No, it was my fault.
I'm not cited on the fine detail of it, but we had a very quick look at it, and I understand that the system of voting, remote voting, that the European Union has implemented is quite convoluted. I think it involves voting sheets being faxed out to MEPs for them to fill in and then fax back from designated machines. So we didn't delve into that anymore because a quick glance told us it probably wouldn't meet the security requirements for a system of remote voting that we were looking for.
Thank you so much. That's all the time we have. Thank you, Dr. Duncan. Next up for 2 minutes, we have the leader of our Green Party of Canada. 2 minutes, Ms. May, please.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and lovely to learn from all of you. Actually, speaking of Greens, I was going to ask Mr. Hamlin, my friend, the member for Brighton Pavilion, has Green Carolyn Lucas has described to me how you vote in the UK in normal circumstances in the Palace of Westminster. And it's so different from how we vote in Canada. I wonder if you could describe it for our members. I mean, it's already not required that people be at a physical desk and stand in their place. And if you could describe it, I think it would give us a context for how this hub portal was an easier transition for you.
Yes, so the traditional method of voting in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords is when the question is put and members make clear to the Speaker they wish to divide the House. members leave the chamber and walk through one or other lobby, the I lobby or the no lobby, and obviously they will come from anywhere else on the parliamentary estate if they're there in time, and they have 8 minutes to get into those lobbies. They will then pass a desk where a House of Commons staff will take their names using on laptops, so we get an electronic record of who has voted. They then pass 2 tellers who are members of Parliament, one from each side of the question, who count them. At the end of that process, the tellers then announce the numbers in the House. We then publish the list of members voting online as soon as possible thereafter.
So it takes. Sorry, it always seems to us in Canada, we think we're exactly like the Parliament of Westminster, but we're certainly our Speaker of the House gets a list of questions now from all the party whips, whereas in the UK, the letter goes to the Speaker to say, I'd like to ask a question, and the Speaker decides. There are some differences, but in this case, basically the public, the point I was going to make to my colleagues is the public never sees a member of Parliament in the UK cast their vote, because they're essentially, in our parliament, it would be the government lobby and the opposition lobby that are essentially corridors in which members proceed with an aye or a nay, depending on the corridor. You cast your vote by going down or running down the corridor till you catch someone's eye to be recorded on an iPad. Is that a good summary of how you vote before the pandemic?
You walk down a corridor. The fact you have voted is obviously public, and we publish that online and in Hansard. But
thank you. That's all the time we have, Mr. Hamley. Thank you. And next up, we have Ms. Blaney, please, for 2 minutes.
Mr. McGowan, I'm just wondering about interpretation for the cabinet meetings. Is this service provided by the Translation Bureau? And if not, are they certified or uncertified freelancers? Do you know that?
I don't. So I have done very badly on answering the questions this morning, just in terms of my areas of responsibility. So my understanding in terms of the way Cabinet is functioning right now, it's obviously fewer Cabinet ministers in the room, and there's reduced staff supporting it. But I do not know the specifics in terms of how it's working.
Is that something you could find out for the committee and let us know?
Absolutely. Just so I have it specifically in terms of your concern, what specifically would you like to know?
I'm just wanting to know if the interpretation for cabinet is provided by the Translation Bureau, and if not, if they are certified or uncertified freelancers. Thank you so much. Mr. Hamlin, if I could just come back to you, I'm just wondering if there's been any matters of privilege that have been addressed during this period of time.
No, none have been raised on the 4 sitting days we've had so far.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just curious about that, because that is, of course, a major concern for our parliament as well. And as a huge country, I'm very far away from Ottawa, and I know that some people are concerned about that. And my last question is just going to come to Ms. Davies. Thank you so much. You talked about how you're doing sort of this new form of voting. If you could just talk about that a little bit more. And I'm also just curious about if there's any video or audio cuts and they're not able to vote, what happens because their vote can represent the entire party. So I'm just curious about that.
Okay, so we had changes to our standing orders to enable weighted voting. And what that means is that each party group, one person is nominated to cast the votes of the entire group on their behalf. And in the case of the government, it includes the Labour Party and the 2 independent, or 1 independent and 1 Liberal Democrat member that make up the government. And in the case of the independents, we have 4 independent members. They cast their vote on themselves. So therefore, in the case of the independents, if they were not to attend the session, then they would not vote as per a normal physical session. In relation to sort of if there was a technical problem and the individual in question was not there to cast the vote, there would be the option for the speaker to check to see if one of the other members of the party concerned wanted to cast the vote on behalf of the group, as long as that was an understanding in advance that they were prepared to do that. But if there was a problem where the member casting the votes on behalf of the group had dropped out, for example, then we would not proceed with the vote. We would have to have a technical break to bring that person back online, because, as you say, you couldn't proceed if somebody was incapable of casting a vote.
Thank you, Ms. Davies, and thank you to all of our witnesses today. It's always very fascinating to compare ourselves, our rules and procedure to other parliaments around the world, and of course, all the insight that the Privy Council brought to this meeting as well. Thank you to all of you, and we'll take a short 5-minute break. I'm sorry we have to be so tight before so that we can switch panels and be back. So please be back for 12:45 exactly to start with our second panel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to get started so that I just want to make sure at the beginning everyone can click at the top right-hand corner of their screen to ensure that they're on gallery view. This is the view that you should be, in which you should be able to see all of the participants. For those of you who are just joining us, before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, you can either click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, or you can hold down the space bar while you are speaking. When you release the space bar, your mic will mute itself. This is just like a walkie-talkie. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. The use of headsets is strongly encouraged. And I would now like to welcome our second panel of witnesses to today's committee hearing. We're very pleased to have Mr. Gordon Barnhart, former clerk of the Senate, Mr. Joseph Mago, former law clerk and parliamentary counsel. He's also the author of Parliamentary Privilege in Canada, and we're sure to be learning a lot from your experience. And third, we have Mr. Gary O'Brien, former clerk of the Senate. Welcome all to the committee, and we'd like to start by hearing from Mr. Barnhart, please. Mr. Barnhart, if you can unmute your mic and please give your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members of the committee. It's my pleasure to be here and to be able to share some ideas with you. Also, I'm deeply honored to be sharing the panel with Joe Mengo and Gary O'Brien, two longtime colleagues. And so it feels just like home, even if I'm in Saskatchewan and everyone else is spread across Canada. I want to thank you for the invitation to appear before the committee to discuss ways that members can fulfill their duties while the House is adjourned due to COVID-19. I have to declare a bias, though, first off, as a former clerk of the Saskatchewan Legislative Assembly and then the Senate of Canada. I have 25 years of accumulated service, and thus I'm a huge supporter of the Canadian parliamentary system. As members of Parliament will know, you have various roles to fulfill, and one of them is represent your constituents. 2, to review legislation. 3, to express grievance before supply, in other words, financial review. And finally, to hold the government accountable. And these are no easy tasks when the House is sitting in a usual way. That makes it even more difficult now. When you're able to meet in person, that encourages rigorous and healthy debate. But with the physical distancing requirements due to COVID-19, that old normal doesn't apply now. I therefore strongly recommend that Parliament should continue to meet, especially during abnormal times. And thus I want to explore with you some options that should be considered and I think are being tested in some way. First off, the House over the last 6 weeks has met on a number of limited number of members to allow physical distancing. And I support this action, and I encourage the House to meet like this on a regular basis. The House, with a limited number of members, will lack the intensity of the debate, but that, I think, is better than no meetings at all. How often should the House meet? Well, that is a political decision. I know by nature of government, they want fewer meetings, and by nature of opposition, they tend to want more meetings. So I will leave it with you as to how you find that compromise. But I think a compromise must be found so that Parliament will meet on a regular basis. The drawback of, in the interests of good governance, I think we need to find a way for Parliament to be able to meet on a regular basis. The drawback to the option of this meeting with limited number of people is that the members who are farther away from Ottawa are limited in their ability to attend. And so I also think that an option of meeting by distance would be a good option. I'll use the word Zoom because that's what we're using here, but there could be many other different ways of doing it. In Saskatchewan, through the municipalities of Saskatchewan, we're having meetings now of up to 400 people at a time, and they are able to listen, to see the speaker, to offer comments, to ask questions. But the drawback to that is it doesn't allow for freewheeling debate like you would have if you're meeting in person. But again, I make that argument, it's better than nothing at all. One of the advantages, I guess, of this system is there's no heckling, but that maybe is a drawback as well. One of the possible drawbacks of meeting by distance is that for those members that don't have Wi-Fi, Saskatchewan is a vast province and a small population, and yet we are able to make virtual meetings happen, and I'm encouraging you to make every effort to do that across Canada. Today, I'm doing this presentation, by the way, without Wi-Fi, but thanks to Personal Hotspot, I'm able to connect through my iPhone and see you here today. Committee hearings, I think, on another hand, are well adapted to virtual meetings just because of the smaller size. And thus, I would encourage Parliament to have a greater use of committees. They can be connected through Zoom without much difficulty. And even though we miss that personal approach, I think that from now on, a lot of the business could be done through committees virtually. The question now is, with the House, with the physical spacing and the virtual meetings, perhaps a combination would be the appropriate way to go. But is the Constitution or the standing orders being violated? And I would argue not. It could be offered that Parliament is not, if Parliament is not able to meet, then the members are not able to fulfill their roles and the spirit of the Constitution is not being followed. With a virtual meeting of the House, for example, as long as a quorum is present in the House in person, that requirement to sit to meet quorum would be met. Members attending electronically would be in addition to that quorum. And since all of the members can meet, and if the members can all meet under those two circumstances, then there needs to be an agreement in terms of a minority parliament if there's going to be a division of a smaller number meeting in the House. If you had a confidence vote, you have to make sure that that agreement is followed so that there is a no defeat of a government. If there was a defeat, if there was a breakdown of that agreement just because of the limited number meeting in the House, I would argue the government general would take into account the circumstances in deciding whether another election would be called, the government would be defeated, or would they be carrying on. I would argue, too, that any political party that is playing games with the numbers during a pandemic would face a negative outcry, and thus I'm sure that that would not happen. If all of the members were allowed to meet virtually, as well as those in the House, that I think would be the easiest way because you would avoid that division of how many members could be there, and the possibility of defeat of a government would be much, much less. So particularly in times of crisis, the public wants their parliament to function well. And I cannot see any constitutional or procedural reasons why a combination of those two options shouldn't be followed. A possible objection to virtual meetings would be how is a vote counted? At present, as you know, a member must be present and standing in the House to declare their vote. And I know that by virtual meetings, voting can happen. A vote can have a great significance in the House by stand and be counted. That's a common phrase, but during these unusual times, you may not have that show of public support, but you have to be able to vote, and that electronic system will show that it has been valid. The electronic system will show how many people have voted and how they have voted, and so I think that is well within the rules. So neither of the above options are effective and as attractive as meeting in person, but for now, these options are better than no parliamentary sitting at all. Once the pandemic has passed, Parliament must return to its former method of meeting. The Canadian parliamentary system has existed since before Confederation through world wars, economic depressions. It must find a way to function during this pandemic. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next, we have Mr. Mango, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to deal with the question of immunity that's involved in the proceedings of the House and of the committee. And so I'll just start. I'll give you a brief history and try to come down to the present. Parliamentary privilege is a branch of the law of Parliament, and it's an elusive subject, and it's a long history, as long as Parliament. Canada's parliamentary privileges are based on those of Westminster, and during the days of the High Court of Parliament in England, the concern was to get the member to Parliament. He had the privilege protection from actions against the person of the against his person, sorry, in the beginning. He did not have to worry about what the public would say about his words or actions in Parliament, because the public was not privy to Parliament or its proceedings. But the king was, through his mouthpiece, the Speaker. Consequently, the next step was to be protected from the king for words and actions in Parliament. That was eventually resolved by the Article 9 of the Bill of Rights in 1689, which says more or less, whatever is said in Parliament or in a proceeding may not be questioned any place outside of Parliament. That arose from the time of following the 1640s, Charles I lost his head. So this Article 9 of the Bill of Rights provided freedom of speech to the member and protection from third-party liability for what he said or did in a parliamentary proceeding. Now, although the member could publish for his own use, members were prohibited by House resolutions at the time from repeating outside Parliament what they or others had said or done in Parliament. A member repeated outside of the House of Commons at his legal peril what he did, what he had said in the House. And any publishing on his or his own, such as household mailings, were not published, not protected rather. Now, while parliamentary privilege protected the member in Parliament, it was the common law that protected the use of Hansard. A faithful report in a public newspaper of a debate containing disparaging matter to the character of an individual that had been spoken in the course of a debate was quite proper. It is privileged on the same principle as an accurate report of proceedings in a court of justice. That is, that the advantage of publicity to the community at large outweighs any private injury resulting from the publication. But defamatory matter contained in a report tabled in the House, but otherwise forming no part of the proceeding, Parliament, that was permitted, that was printed, was not protected.
Mr. Mago, I know that you are going slowly, but I guess due to the fact that you don't have a headset, the interpreters have informed me that they're having a little bit of difficulty. So maybe if you could speak closer to the mic and even slower if possible. Thank you.
Right. Sorry. Thank you. Yes. No, that item, that was because of the famous case in 1839 in Stockdale versus Hansard, which every parliamentary clerk and officer would be aware of. Now, of course, such a report tabled in the House and published by order of the House is protected by the Parliament of Canada Act. Then, when the proceedings of Parliament were broadcast, it is provided that persons producing radio and television are employees of the Parliament and they produce an electronic hazard. That is, an audio-visual report of the House without embellishment or editorial. The sittings of committees of the House are also now broadcast, as in the case of the printed Hansard, the electronic Hansard, now provided in the House of Commons, is a verbatim report of what has transpired audibly, and in the case of television, visually. The debates, whether or not broadcast, are nevertheless, they're still part of debates of Parliament, in Parliament. per Article 9 of the Bill of Rights. In a study of the privileges of members of the Parliament of Britain, the Select Committee of the House of Commons on Broadcasting in 1966 said members of Parliament whose speech is broadcast would continue to be protected by absolute privilege in respect of what he or she said in debate in the House. The member is, in law, speaking on an occasion of absolute privilege, and the means of publication is irrelevant. Now, parliamentary privilege is the necessary immunity that the law provides for members to do their legislative work, including the Assembly's work in holding the government to account. It is also the necessary immunity that the law provides for anyone taking part in a proceeding in Parliament. To the question, necessary in relation to what? Therefore, the answer is necessary to protect members in the discharge of their legislative and deliberative functions, and the Legislative Assembly's work in holding the government to account for the country's business. In addition, it is the right, power, and authority of each House of Parliament to perform their constitutional functions. Now, the Supreme Court of Canada pointed out that in the UK, the privileges of Parliament are rights absolutely necessary for the due execution of its powers, and that Canadian legislative bodies properly claim as inherent privileges those rights that are necessary to their capacity to function as legislative bodies. There is no dispute in the case law that necessity is the test. The sittings, the House of Commons itself, and the sittings of a committee of Parliament are constitutionally inherent, and its exercise are not subject to judicial review and constitutes one of the internal proceedings of all who participate in it are protected. So anyone participating in a committee of the House or the House is protected. The Supreme Court of Canada confirmed that the courts defer to the internal proceedings of legislative bodies. They affirmed that the Houses of Parliament are the sole judge of the lawfulness of its proceedings, and that is fully established in the United Kingdom, while also approving that in settling or departing from its own procedure, the House can practically change or supersede the law. The dictionary definition, virtual, says having the essence or effect, but not the appearance or form. As in the case of the House of Commons, a virtual sitting of a committee of the House constitutes a sitting and part of the internal proceedings of the House, and parliamentary privilege prevails, in line with the principle that prevails in a proceeding of a virtual court of justice. So I submit this respectfully.
Thank you. Mr. O'Brien, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, for your invitation to appear. I seem to have an unstable internet connection, so I hope I can get through this without any problem. I would like to discuss some of the procedural issues relating to the implementation of a platform for virtual sittings, for full virtual sittings. As I understand it, the proposal for virtual sittings is being offered as a temporary solution to balance parliamentary duties with caution over the COVID-19 pandemic. Although the intention is to make such sittings temporary, nonetheless, I think it would be helpful for the committee to have a detailed analysis, or better, an audit of how these new technologies may impact the various procedures of the House, and more importantly, the consequences flowing from those changes. This way, your committee would have a big picture of what is at stake. The testimony you have received to date from speakers and former speakers, as well as clerks and law clerks, is invaluable but perhaps a comprehensive study undertaken by your table research team with the participation of members of the House will allow you to better assess what changes will have minimal impact versus those which may come close to altering the Chamber's fundamental procedural characteristics. Such an analysis may assist you in recommending the kinds of hybrid processes or first steps in going forward to implement a virtual sittings platform. Studying proposed revisions to standing orders during a crisis without having the time to understand which amendments may transform the Chamber's essential characteristics is never the best practice for policymaking. I acknowledge your institution may be under important peer pressure at the moment as other legislatures around the world are moving to virtual operations in response to these challenges posed by the pandemic. But given the hand you are dealt with, at the very least, it may be helpful to identify which procedures may be most affected and which are not if a virtual platform is to be adopted. I fully agree with the testimony given by the former acting clerk a few days ago that it may be more efficient to build on existing practices. Please keep in mind that other legislatures are also exploring alternatives to physical meetings, but within the constitutional, statutory, and rules-based constraints of their legislative processes. Clearly, there are some procedures where certain parts of the Chamber's business can be taken virtually. At Westminster, the House of Commons has agreed that remote technology can be used for key items of business, such as questions, urgent questions, and ministerial statements. The Samara Center for Democracy, in its brief to your committee, has identified take-note debates where members give their views on a topic but do not take binding votes as a procedure appropriate for a virtual parliament. However, my own assessment of the ultimate goal of allowing Parliament to operate as far as virtually as possible without a continued physical presence in Ottawa appears to me to go beyond changing just the workways of the House. The introduction of technologies permitting members to absent themselves from the institution, allowing them to attend via video link, seems a much more fundamental change. I would like to identify three procedures which may undergo significant alteration. My first fundamental concern is with the rule of attendance. The marginal note of Standing Order 15 states that attendance is required. I'm confident that advice can be given so that the wording of the rule can be amended to procedurally allow for the use of virtual platforms. Setting aside the legal argument, a question must be raised whether the intention of the rule will be fundamentally altered. In research I prepared for my doctorate on parliamentary practice in pre-Confederation Canada, I came upon this entry for September 16, 1842, in the Legislative Assembly of the United Province of Canada. The House used to fix a day for the call of the House, requiring that all members attend. If any members were absent, the Speaker sent them a letter, as he did this day, saying, "The House, in directing me to give you notice, is actuated by the greatest unwillingness to believe that such unexplained absence would have arisen from any such neglect or indifference as would render an honorable member liable to the censure of the House." From the beginning of legislative practice in Canada, the first duty of any member of Parliament was to attend sittings, and failure to do so without a valid reason for many decades brought censure from their colleagues. Standing Order 15 has been a permanent rule of the House since 1867. Notwithstanding the many demands and obstacles which members of Parliament have always had to face, the principle that the physical attendance of members is required for the House to fulfill its constitutional duties has been a constant theme as to how the legislature should operate. This may now change. What the consequences are should be explored. My second concern is with counting a quorum. O'Brien and Bosk, second edition, states the following with regard to quorum. Under the Constitution Act, a quorum of 20 members, including the Speaker, is required to constitute a meeting of the House for the exercise of its powers. In this regard, the Deputy Speaker said, "The Speaker is not in a position to tell members from either side of the House who should be in his or her place, or how many members should be available for any debate in counting a quorum. In accordance with this citation, a member to be counted for quorum must be physically in his or her place. If a virtual platform is implemented for legislative sittings, a different process would have to be established. Please keep in mind that the Standing Order on Quorum is also a constitutional provision and is part of the Constitution Act 1867. Historically, before the Act of Union of 1840, which united Ontario and Quebec to become the United Province of Canada, the issue of quorum was of great controversy. There had often been heated discussion and uncertainty in the assemblies of Upper and Lower Canada as to what an appropriate quorum should be given the pioneer conditions of the country and the linguistic and religious divisions within society. The rules of both assemblies were amended many times in this respect. By making it a statutory regulation and including it in the Constitution of the province, it was hoped that the controversy over quorum would cease. Finally, I'm concerned with proposals permitting electronic voting. Measures that allow for the use of electronic voting to the exclusion of other components of conducting a legislative debate in Parliament misunderstands the nature of parliamentary procedure. Voting is a crucial stage, but it is only one of two others which go into the making of a decision on a bill, and all three stages are linked. The other two stages are the proposing of a motion and then its debate. In theory, as per the rules of the House, all members are attend the sitting so that they know about the motion through the reading of the order paper, for example, the introduction of a bill, then to think about it for 2 days in order to prepare their thoughts, and then to commence its debate. Some classical political theorists believe that legislative debate is the most important constitutional principle there can possibly be and is the basis for democracy. Parliaments are steeped in tradition because those traditions are meaningful. Allowing for only electronic voting may belittle other aspects of making a legislative decision and may not respect the important principle of parliamentary procedure. In conclusion, as I've mentioned, I believe a detailed analysis or audit of how these new technologies may impact various House procedures could be of assistance to you. In addition to those subjects I've discussed, the audit could include the rules of order and debate, how the speaker will recognize those who wish to participate in debate, what a virtual parliament would actually look like in the assignment of seats, how to appropriately acknowledge national and international tragedies, and the procedure for royal assent. A full analysis will obviously be a longer-term project, but one which your committee may want to pursue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will now continue questions. First up will be Mr. Richards for the Conservative Party.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I guess I'll start with Mr. Manjo. You discussed the concept of privilege in your opening remarks. It just wasn't completely clear, so maybe I'll ask for some clarification from you. Are your thoughts that virtual sittings, that there may be some concern with privilege? For example, if a member is unable to access the virtual sittings because they haven't got quality enough internet service, for example, and I think you indicated that the words covered by the words spoken during these virtual meetings or virtual sittings, there may be some concern about whether they would be covered by parliamentary privilege. Was I understanding that correctly? Can you maybe just touch on those two topics?
Actually, it was the contrary.
Oh.
I'm of the view that parliamentary privilege prevails because it's a sitting of the House or sitting of, and the procedures, the inner procedures of the House are a subject of the concern of the House, and the courts defer to the privileges of the House, which relates to their inner proceedings. And so I don't think there's any. As a matter of fact, the only one of the few when I was looking up, checking as anybody would, I noticed that the Parliament of Western Australia looked into the question of of virtual sittings, and they did the only aspect they didn't cover, weren't worried about. They weren't worried about the parliamentary privilege aspect of it.
Okay. What about the other concept though, the one where because there's obviously a built-up body of speakers' rulings and otherwise that would indicate like where people have been physically unable to access the House of Commons for whatever reason, they've been delayed or held up in some way from being able to access the House of Commons. I suppose you could make the argument that if you're not able to access it in these virtual sittings because you don't have internet connection or whatever the reason might be, that your privilege has been breached. What would your thoughts be on that? Would that be potentially a breach of a member's privilege if they weren't able to be a part of these virtual sittings because of those kinds of reasons?
Well, it seems to me, unless the member was prevented from attending because it was a member wanting to attend a session, the excuse of missing a plane or being sick or any other reason other than that, it seems to me would not prevail. It would be the same as if you were sitting in the traditional way. If you're not prevented, if someone doesn't prevent you for coming because you're a member, well then it's up to you to attend.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know. Make myself clear, but members who can't get to a meeting, well, it would only be if they're obstructed,
right, as
a member attending. Otherwise, right, it's up to you to get there.
Sure. So if it was held as a virtual sitting, and as I say, where the region you live in, there's just not the internet connection available to do that. And I understand that may have occurred the other day for some members. I haven't been able to confirm that. If that just prevented from being able to log on, would that then be considered the same as if someone had physically obstructed them from entering?
No, I'm not sure if I heard everything you said, but the point is that unless you're being obstructed as a member of Parliament from attending a sitting of the House or a sitting of a committee, there's no contempt of Parliament involved.
Understood. So you wouldn't see, the lack of internet access there, for a virtual sitting being considered obstruction in some way?
I would not, because this is part of the proceedings of the committee that the committee itself established to use and adopt.
Okay. I understand you were the law clerk at the time when the House moved to televising of the proceedings. Is that correct?
Yes.
So was there anything from that time, any lessons to be learned from that sort of switchover, which would be helpful in looking at this? And would you advise kind of caution, this is being looked at as an emergency thing right now. Would you advise caution in looking at this as a long-term thing? Would this be something you would advise only using for these types of situations where, we're an emergency, or was it something you think can be moved to quickly as a permanent type of a thing?
Well, you heard from members elsewhere in other jurisdictions, which is very appropriate. With respect to when the committees were broadcast, it was broken in gradually, and there was some concern at the beginning about the immunity, but that was settled, and of course then it was settled by the UK, and we agreed with that. But it's a question of it's brand new, and it's necessity is the mother of invention.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Next up is Mr. Gerritsen, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I guess, Mr. Mengwa, I'll pick up where Mr. Richards left off.
I'm so sorry. What was it, Mr. Gerritsen? Oh, yes, it is. Sorry, I didn't make a mistake. I'm looking at the second round. Sorry.
I'll just pick up where Mr. Richards left off. So just so that we're absolutely clear here, it's your opinion as former law clerk that parliamentary privilege would not be breached as a result of not having the proper internet connection. That's correct?
I'm not sure if I understand
Well, Mr. Richards was asking about the internet connection and if there could be parliamentary privilege if you didn't have access. And my understanding is that you're saying that you don't see that as a breach of parliamentary privilege.
Well, no, of course, if you were connected to the committee, you would be a part of the virtual committee, as we are right now, and you're all connected to it and part of it. And so if somebody outside of that, if they're not part of that virtual committee, well, they're not part of a...
But if I had an internet connection and something happened, say, for example, a cell phone tower went down and my internet connection suddenly became not available, would you regard that as a breach of my parliamentary privilege?
We're bringing in Mother Nature now.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. So my interpretation of what you're saying to Mr. Richards is that it depends on the obstruction, like you being prevented from getting to be part of the meeting. And that wouldn't necessarily be the case. Is that correct?
No, that would be a technical matter, which I would raise in the House and see if we try to resolve that.
Okay. Mr. Barnhart, you spoke about seeing the possibility of committee work more regularly being done by this type of platform because you said that it was smaller meetings, easier to manage the people, and that's something that's very similar to what former Speaker Milliken said when he came on a few days ago. He seemed to it didn't seem as though he was against the idea of Parliament operating that way. In fact, he said that he saw some technical restrictions to making it more difficult to occur. Is that your same interpretation of it?
Well, thank you very much for that question. And yes, I think that interpretation is correct. I'll respond to your first question, though, in terms of, is it temporary? I'm a traditionalist, and I would love, once this pandemic is over, that we return to having the House sitting in the House of Commons and committees working. Now committees travel across Canada and that sort of thing. So I would like to see that return in that sense. But in the meantime, I think we're facing a pandemic, and rather than having just press releases from time to time, I really want to see Parliament active and very much involved.
And I think
in terms of,
sorry, please finish your thought. Finish your thought.
And in terms of the committees, my point there, I think, really is because it's a smaller number. I mean, we're seeing today we've got roughly 8, 10, 12 people online, and other than Gary with his connection, which happens from time to time, I think it's working very well. I can see everyone. I can hear people.
And the truth of the matter is that from time to time, I might miss a plane, or I might miss my ride, or I drive in from Kingston. I might get stuck in traffic.
And I appreciate that not having the internet, the Wi-Fi is a problem. But as I mentioned today, I'm doing this without Wi-Fi. I'm doing it through a cell phone.
Right.
Now, you're correct that perhaps the whole cell system could go down, or the whole electrical system would go down. But
I'm running out of time. Sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to follow up on a point. So your position seems to be, from a practical implication, it's more difficult to manage more people in a virtual setting like this. And that was Speaker Milliken's his position on it too. but assume for a second that it was totally manageable and there was a platform and there was a way to completely handle it, and it was just as easy as to do as this meeting is to do. Would you see anything wrong with functioning that way in times of emergency, which is what this committee is looking at right now?
Right. No, I would agree. In times of emergency, I think, and it showed the other day, that was, I know, a bit of an experimental trial run. The feedback that I've had is basically it worked quite well. There were a few members that weren't able to connect, but those bugs, I think, could be worked out. Once the pandemic is over, I'm hopeful, though, that Parliament would resume meeting in the House of Commons. But I would also make the argument, following up on what Gary said, quorum, I would say, should be quorum in the House of Commons, 20 people with distancing, and the rest could be joined by virtual connection.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Next, Madame Normandin.
Ms. Normandin. Thank you. I'm also going to follow up on this. Mr. Mango, you were saying that internet connection does not constitute obstruction because it's out of control of the Parliament. It's like missing a plane or getting caught in a storm. So I'd like to flip it and ask you this. If we wanted more of a physical presence in the House, if we wanted longer days with more members, would there be obstruction if there were older MPs or sick MPs or immune-compromised MPs or MPs with children who were afraid of going to Parliament? Would that be obstruction? Because it's getting in the way of what Parliament could normally do.
Mother's native tongue, but people can't get there for a variety of things other than being obstructed. It's not, it doesn't represent a contempt of Parliament. Age or otherwise, people have to make their way. People are elected who have disabilities. They make their way. And unless you're actually obstructed, I don't see any concern. J'espère que j'ai bien compris votre question.
And I hope I understood your question. Well, it was a little difficult. But Mr. Barnhart and Mr. O'Brien, from the very beginning, we've heard arguments in favor or against virtual Parliament, but we haven't weighed the pros and the cons. For example, there can be bad internet connections, but if we increase sittings in person, then we're disadvantaging some people. I'd like you to discuss that, please. Mr. Barnhart.
Thank you, Gordon. The essence of my presentation was that the committee should try to get a big picture of not just the changes, but the consequences of those changes. We don't really understand. It's so new, and we can make the rule change, but what effect does it have on the House, the functioning of the House? Little things like how important the lobbies used to be, where members would go to the lobby, and the folklore is that most of the business took place in the lobbies. How is that all going to be impacted by a virtual platform? That's my major point. Thank you.
And thank you for that question. And my French has become rather rusty since leaving Ottawa. But if I understood you correctly, in terms of balancing the risks of electronic versus the health risks of the pandemic, I think with appropriate physical distancing, a house can meet having 20, perhaps 30 people spread around. I think the risk isn't all that high and should be practiced. but to make sure that others can participate, a greater number of people can participate, I would therefore weigh on the side of virtual attendance by the other members.
Well, then maybe to clarify, I would say when we're talking about parliamentary privilege, if we were going to reduce the number of virtual sittings and increase the number of sittings in person, would that have a negative impact on parliamentary privilege for members, for example, who are immune compromised?
That privilege would apply, and I think this is what Mr. Mengo is arguing as well. I think the privilege would apply whether you're there in person or whether you're attending by Zoom. And privilege would apply if you're saying something on Zoom that could be considered to be unparliamentary. I think it is, whether you're on virtual or whether you're there in person.
Madame la Présidente, est-ce qu'il me reste du temps? Do I have any time left, Madam Chair? Mr. Mengo, I have a hypothetical question for you. With the new electronic platforms, we may actually even be able to write down questions, write comments, suggest questions to others. So in your opinion, if we're going to be able to express ourselves that way, do you think there would be the same protection, for example, against libel, for example, if we're writing things down? Does the same protection apply?
Whether it's virtual or whether it's not virtual, the privileges remain the same. I suspect that if we're still speaking in terms of members who have difficulty getting about, that's not a matter of privilege. Getting to and fro the House is up to the member, and unless he's been obstructed, there's no relation to immunity or parliamentary privilege.
Thank you, Mr. Mago. Next, we have Ms. Blaney.
Thank you all for being here today. My first question is really about the reality that we're facing right now and how quickly we've had to respond, and other governance systems across the planet have had to respond to this issue. I'm just wondering if you agree that Parliament should be looking at a more staggered approach, implementing different virtual proceedings one at a time and correcting as we go. I think this is a huge amount of work that we need to look at. I think the administration is doing a fantastic job, but there's a lot of challenges and changes with technology. And if I could please get the first answer from Mr. Mengo.
Mr. Mengo?
Yes, I'm not sure if I see the question properly, Madam Member.
Could you repeat your question or rephrase?
Absolutely. Yes. So what I'm asking is, as we are a committee looking at how to implement a short-term virtual parliament, would you recommend a more staggered approach?
A more staggered?
Staggered. So not all at once, but a staggered approach.
Staggered?
Staggered.
Staggered approach. I'm not sure what you mean by a staggered approach, but we're now sitting in a virtual sitting.
Mr. Mengo, I believe she means like in different stages and different phases and not all at once.
Oh, I see. I'm starting. Oh, I see.
Thank you.
Well, that I don't know how I could answer to that. It's a technical problem dealing with procedures and and that's I want to restrict myself to the area with which I'm most familiar.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Thank you very much for that question, and I don't mind jumping in. And I think I understand what you're saying in terms of having a staggered approach, but I would argue in favor of having it all simultaneous. If you had, say, 25 physically in the house with distancing, and the remainder, however many, online, I think that could work. It has been shown that it's working somewhat now. And I don't think that staggering it would make it simpler. I think it would make it more complicated. So that would be what I'd recommend.
Mr. O'Brien, anything to add?
Yes, I would agree with a staggered approach. I gather the UK is at House of Commons at Westminster is starting slow and moving, seeing how it works, perhaps starting with question period, minister statements, that sort of thing. The values of Parliament are so much at stake. And I know it's a terrible illness. The pandemic it's so terrible. There's no question about that. But this is our constitution. This is our primary constitutional institution, and we should guard that as much as possible.
Well, thank you, Mr. O'Brien. I guess another question that I have is, as we've gone through this process, one of the things I've reflected on is how organic it has been as we figure out how to move forward. And we know that holding the government to account, making sure that the processes are transparent so that Canadians understand, and that democracy continues even in a pandemic is absolutely important. I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts that you have on sort of having this opportunity to create a set of standing orders that we could shelve during normal times. And I agree, those discussions that happen in lobbies between parliamentarians of different parties are so important. So, but sort of a standing orders that we can put away, but if something like this ever happens again and we're not able to sit in person, that we can pull those out and have at least a framework to start on.
Thank you. I would agree that we should try to get a template. And that's why I'm proposing that we have the experts plus the assistance of members to try to, not in a time of crisis, but try to rationalize what would work, what would have minimal impact on the House. We don't want to open a Pandora's box for other future crises. And I think I know it may take a little bit of time, but you certainly have the expertise in the House of Commons to perform this function.
Thank you. Mr. Barnhart, do you have anything to add to that? Any thoughts?
Yes, I agree with Mr. O'Brien that we want to be careful on this. I like your idea of having two sets of standing orders, one for normal times and another for abnormal, because this COVID-19 is not going to be unique. I think we're going to have another one come at some time in the future. I like your idea. The issue would be who's going to make the decision to flip the switch from the standing orders for normal times to abnormal times. Mm-hmm. But I certainly agree with you that it's certainly worth considering. The rules, you have to, though, be able to make sure that Parliament is adaptable to the circumstance and not just say, well, we've got a crisis, so we can't meet. That would be the extreme that I certainly wouldn't support.
Thank you, Mr. Barnhart. Next, we have Mr. Broussard for 4 minutes, please. If we can agree to do what we did in the last panel and just do 4 minutes and then 2. Thank you. Mr. Broussard, you have to unmute and then start again.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Barnhart, Mr. O'Brien, and Mr. Mango, thank you so much for being here. I really found your insight valuable. And I really want to pick up on the theme of Parliament within a pandemic. The challenge that we have is this is presumably a temporary measure, and there's very little in the way of government business that is being done. Most of it is in response to the pandemic. So as it relates to what we're dealing with now, a temporary version, and then as Ms. Blaney said, and this was really the direction that I wanted to go, on flipping the switch, if you will, we have to look at this as on a temporary basis, given the situation we're in now, and what trigger points would occur in the future. And I want to get your perspective on both of those. And I do have one question, Mr. O'Brien, that I want to ask you. So if you can make it quick, both of you, I would appreciate that. What would be those trigger points, in your opinion?
Well, maybe Gordon, you could start with that.
I'm not sure just exactly what a trigger point would be. You're right. I think Parliament right now, government is focused right on the pandemic. But I wouldn't want to see government focused on that solely, because the rest of the other issues in the country have to be addressed. And I think we also have to make sure that you as a member of Parliament, be it government opposition, you have to be in a position to be able to hold the government accountable. In terms of the trigger point, I guess the declaration of the pandemic would be a trigger point in my mind. And that would be WHO would be making that declaration. But I think it would also be an agreement with the House of Commons to say, as Ms. Blaney has said, you'd have that second set of standing orders that you switch over to that in a pandemic would be a trigger point in my mind.
Mr. O'Brien?
Well, certainly the nature of the crisis is it's a health and safety issue. So health and safety issues are paramount, but all parliamentary business is important. I know government legislation, emergency legislation is key, but also a vote of confidence. You have to have confidence in a government that's facing this crisis. So all these factors have to be put into it. It's not black and white, I don't think.
It's very difficult in the committee's mandate of 5 meetings to come up with what all of those scenarios are going to look like. And so I agree with you, Mr. O'Brien, that we have to have a post-mortem on this crisis to determine what the consequences are going forward. My last question is to you, Mr. O'Brien. You spoke about the rules of attendance being required under Standing Order 15, and the principle of physical attendance in the House of Commons. What are the consequences of members not being in attendance?
Well, that's the kind of thing I think needs to be looked at, and members themselves can give that answer perhaps better than I can. But it certainly changes the dynamic of the House completely. And because there's so much informal workways versus the rules of procedure which determine how the House works. So I'm just, the long arm of history is what which is what I'm concerned about. The House has always had obstacles. I'm a student of pre-Confederation history, where the first meeting took place in 1792 in Upper Canada. Imagine the member from Ottawa who had to go all the way to Niagara Falls, which is where that was, the hardships he had to endure to get to Parliament. But he did it because of the importance of the institution. I think we have to keep that in mind, even in this pandemic.
Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thank you. That's all the time we have. Next, Mr. Turnbull, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all the speakers today, or the witnesses today. We appreciate your comments and your incredible depth of experience. It's great to have you. I'm an ethicist. I believe in the precautionary principle, and I believe at this time more than ever in a global pandemic, in a health crisis, we have actually a duty to protect all MPs and all workers and their health, and the risks associated with physical meetings, in my mind, are greater than virtual sittings. Would you agree with that, Mr. Barnhart, that we should be doing everything in our power to have as much virtual sittings at this time in this pandemic as possible to protect people's health?
Yes, I very much agree with you that, for example, my wife and I have been practicing that very much in terms of social distancing, not going out any more than necessary, etc. But
Thank you for doing that.
As well,
I really appreciate.
Sorry, I would argue though that I think. Oh, no, go ahead.
My apologies. I'm just short on time, and I was looking for a quick answer to that one, so I appreciate that. Yep. If you don't mind, I'm just going to move on. Mr. Barnhart, you also mentioned that no heckling could be a positive outcome of some of the virtual sittings. I really do think that heckling in the House, being a relatively new MP, it does impinge upon people's parliamentary privilege to some degree. It makes people feel less self-expressed in a place where they're supposed to feel completely open to that debate. So it's interesting that maybe there's actually some positives out of a virtual environment. I wondered too, the information and communication technology sector has been called by Harvard Business Review a megatrend. A megatrend is something that affects every industry in every aspect of life before it's complete. It started in 1958, well before I was born. But what I'm, privy to is, I think, a very slow adoption rate within Parliament as one of the last maybe areas of society that are adopting digital and information technology to increase inclusivity within debate, which I think it can help to enhance. I wonder if you could tell me about why you think that we might be, very slow to adopt this technology.
I'm assuming that was directed to me, Mr. Turnbull, and I will thank you for your question. You're right. I think that Parliament, first off, has a very long history, as Mr. O'Brien has said, 800 and some years, and it does have an image of being small c conservative, slower to react to change in that sense. And that's not a bad thing in many ways, to make sure that there is consistency and not just reacting to a whim. In terms of your comment on heckling, I'm a traditionalist. I think that heckling can get too much and it can detract. Now I'm starting to lecture members of Parliament, I apologize, but it can start to detract from the image of Parliament. I love to see debate. I love to see the cut and thrust of debate. Heckling, when it gets too much, takes away from that. So that's my opinion.
Thank you for that, Madam Chair. Do I have a chance for one more question, or really quick?
Very quick, 30 seconds for question, 30 seconds for answer.
Okay, for Mr. O'Brien, then a quick question for you. I noticed you talked about some reluctance related to electronic voting. And I just wondered whether you were aware of many other jurisdictions that were rapidly implementing some form of remote or electronic voting at this time, including New Zealand, Brazil, the EU, France, Spain, US, and some of the others that we heard from this morning. Scotland and Wales are both doing it, and even the UK Parliament looks to be testing these kinds of electronic voting at this time. Are you aware of those trends?
Very quick response, yes.
Yes, I am, and I congratulate them for doing so. I guess my point was I did not want to isolate a virtual technology just to electronic voting to the exclusion of the other two stages in making a decision.
Thank you for that.
Okay, Mr. Tucker, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Just quickly, I kind of find it ironic that that Mr. Turnbull was talking about having a safe space and he cut off the last speaker mid-answer. It kind of goes to the fact of some of the limitations with technology and why we need to be in person, and how if we go down the slope, this is a slippery slope on going digital, I believe. An aspect of it even today, I'd like to get our presenters' view on this was my privilege as a member of this committee question where I was kicked off 3 times now with Zoom My internet here in Saskatoon is probably as good as anywhere in Canada. It's not a rural remote, it's not a northern riding, but for 3 occasions that my privilege was compromised by not being able to hear the speaker, the answer, the question, the interpretation for 3 times. This is only a 2-hour or over just over 2 hours time. So I'd like to hear our response. It was my privilege of privilege as a member of this committee impacted by technology.
I was never an expert on privilege, but I heard in my time as a table officer many grievances. And I think the speaker would say you have a grievance, but I'm not sure your fundamental privileges have been breached, which to me means intentional obstruction of preventing you from participating.
Mr. Tucker, I won't disagree with you being a former speaker of the Saskatchewan legislature. And like Gary says, I'm not a expert on privilege either, except to say that I don't think your case would be a privilege case, but certainly of frustration. Technology is improving, and I think it will improve even more as they work out the bugs. And I'm sure from here on in, you'll be much better able to connect.
Thank you on that. Another question I have is how does it, and maybe this is for Mr. Barnard, we talked about, I believe, the cut and thrust of having in-person meetings. I don't think it's not going to be the same digitally versus if you're in person. On the heckling, I would agree that it can be something that can be distracting the speaker. That's what our speaker has the right to have decorum in the chamber. However, there's aspects of the informal communication that heckling in part is a part of our Westminster democracy. And how do we get that, save some of the ability for members to take part in the informal side of things is part of our tradition. So as technology improves, or the platform is developed more for parliamentarians, there's a gap, and I'm just not comfortable going live as much as we are right now with virtual sittings versus taking the time to understand. And that's where if we would have 2 sets of standing orders or a different, if we would agree, and this would take probably months, not weeks, to come to a conclusion of what that would look like. Maybe if I could get some comments from Mr. Barnard on how we would develop that.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Tucker. And yes, I would not want to see the rules for going totally electronic or digital on a permanent basis. I think it's a good way of making sure that Parliament is able to meet during a pandemic, for example. But once the pandemic is over, I'm hopeful that Parliament would go back to its traditional way of meeting in person. I think there's great advantages for that.
Thank you, Mr. Barnhart. Next, we have Ms. May for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you to colleagues for allowing this opportunity. I can see all of your faces. I'm wondering if witnesses, if any of you heard the last panel of evidence from Scotland, Wales, and the UK. If you'd nod, otherwise I'll put, you did not hear. I'll put it to you that one of the things that I found fascinating was that the representative from the UK said the UK speaker had been very concerned in the pandemic that all members of Parliament had access to everything. So rather than have one setting that was physical and a limited number of MPs and another session that was virtual, they've adopted a hybrid model the Palace of Westminster. And I wonder if I can ask in terms of privileges and participation rights, because this appealed to me, if Mr. Mango could comment on this idea of how would that strike you in terms of privileges? People who are at a distance, like myself, I found traveling from BC to Ottawa, which is why I missed PROC yesterday, because it's a day and a half travel these days. We could participate virtually while a skeletal number could be present physically in Parliament. How does that strike you? And you'll have to remove your mute.
Oh, here we are.
You're good to go. We can hear you.
Oh, I thought I had it.
We can hear you, Mr. Mango.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Yes, well, that sounds fine. And it seems to me that would be up to a question of a technical matter for the House of Commons, which could be, if it could be technically provided, because the House, their privileges include how they do their internal proceedings. Mm-hmm. That would be part of an internal proceeding, it seems to be, a combination of virtual and regular. It seems to me that it could be if it could be put into effect technically, because the House has the right to proceed in the manner they feel is necessary for them to perform their function, which is to provide legislation and provide that the House is accountable to the government is accountable. It seems to me that could be done. It's because they can they have the right to proceed in the manner which they see fit and necessary to do their functions.
Thank you, Mr. Mango. I see Mr. O'Brien's mic is not on. Would you like to comment on this as well, Mr. O'Brien?
Yeah.
Oh, you. There you go.
You're good now. You're good now.
Well, I totally agree with a hybrid approach. I think what the speaker.
Oopsie.
Oh, you went back on mute. You went back on mute. Yes. There we go. Now we're good.
I totally agree with a hybrid approach, and what the Speaker of the UK is recommending might be a great way to proceed for us, and proceed slowly if possible.
And lastly, if I have time, I'll go to Mr. Barnhart just to ask his comments on. I'm with you. I don't think heckling is part of our parliamentary tradition. I wonder if you had any comment on that.
Well, on the other one, I totally agree with the hybrid concept as well. And even under the current circumstances with heckling limited, great. And when Parliament resumes in the House of Commons, I hope that heckling will be reduced much more at that time as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I have 2 seconds left, but I'll yield them to someone else.
Thank you. Next up for 2 minutes, we have Madame Normandy.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. My question is to Mr. Barnhart. You said it might be possible to have a confidence vote since this is a minority government. Now we'll have to make recommendations to the committee. These recommendations could apply to the longer term. Do you recommend that we should perhaps set aside the fact that we are in a minority situation to make our recommendations, or on the contrary, to keep that foremost in our minds when making our recommendations?
As I was saying in my presentation, if you have the House meeting with, say, 20 people and physical distancing and an agreement as to which parties are there, it really draws into question then a vote of non-confidence. If you have the hybrid approach of members in the House as well as electronic, then the usual rules of confidence would apply. So I think then it doesn't become a question.
I'd like to hear the opinion of Messieurs Mango and O'Brien on the fact that we must, on whether we should be taking into account the fact that we're a minority government or not.
Mr. Mango, should we be factoring in whether we're a minority government at this point?
Well, factoring in the aspect of minority government, I don't quite get that.
Ms. Normandy, would you like to rephrase?
Peut-être, puisqu'il reste peu de temps, demander à Monsieur O'Brien.
Well, since there's so little time left, maybe just Mr. O'Brien can answer in the little time we have left.
Yes, Madam Chairman, I do think we should factor in the question of confidence. A government can never continue to operate without the confidence of the House of Commons, and that should never take a secondary step, no matter what the situation is.
Donc, je comprends qu'on...
So I understand that we should be making recommendations, keeping in mind that we are in a minority government and in view of the fact that there could be a further crisis in the future. Yes, I entirely agree with you.
Ms. Blaney, for 2 minutes, please.
Well, thank you for some of those questions. I really appreciate the questions of the block member today. You know, one of the things we talked about in the last period that I had with you is having a separate set of standing orders. And I think also just procedures or processes are another part of that. And one of the realities is, and I think Canadians expect to see parliamentarians from different parties collaborating and working together during this crisis, during this pandemic. But one of the things that I have contemplated is the fact that we are in a minority government, which has led to an increased level of collaboration both before and during COVID-19. I'm just wondering around, you know, having that separate set of standing orders to move forward. Should we be looking at how do we increase collaboration between all parties, regardless of if it's a majority or a minority government? And do you have any recommendations on what those could look like? Thank you. And Mr. O'Brien, I'd be happy to start with you.
Thank you very much for the question. Well, the history of parliamentary reform has always been the efficient work of small committees that work in a bipartisan, nonpartisan manner. The major standing orders that changes which were brought in the early 80s, that's the Tom Lefebvre committee, that sort of thing. That's how they worked. I think whenever you talk about standing orders, it should be a lot of cooperation. And I think the smaller the committee, steering, whatever it is the most efficient way to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barnhart.
I would agree. Not only am I opposed to heckling, but I am opposed to a lot of partisan game playing. Parliament is partisan. It has to be because you have the various political parties. But when I was clerk of the Legislative Assembly, for example, as long as the House leader and the opposition leaders were working together, there was good debate, things were moving along. If there was a misunderstanding, if that all broke down, we got nothing done. And that is a shame, I think, and you try and avoid that. So therefore, the nonpartisan cooperation, especially amongst the leaders, is very important.
Thank you. That's all the time we have. I wanted to thank all of the witnesses here today. You've brought a wealth of knowledge and experience to our committee hearing, and it was really nice to be able to bring you together virtually, old colleagues and friends. It was nice to see you all together.
Thank you.
Before we end, there's just a couple of housekeeping items I wanted to bring up. I mentioned them slightly yesterday as well, just to flag them for you. I wanted to update you that, first, Mr. Richards, we will be on the May 4th meeting. We will be having We have invited the International Association of Conference Interpreters and the Canadian Association of Professional Employees for the first panel of the May 4th meeting. And then on the second panel, we will be having the Speaker and the Clerk of the House and the various administrative witnesses that we have agreed on. Because it's only 2 witnesses for the first panel, the Clerk thought it best to have them in for an hour and then leaving 2 hours for the Speaker, the Clerk, because they're very vital and essential to us getting our report done at the very end. I'm sure there are many questions we want to verify with them from what we've learned. After that, I want to just remind you all that we're really going to require the committee to be efficient in their use of time. We essentially have only 2 meetings left to consider the draft report, agree to changes, and then adopt it no later than May 12th or the 13th. That's a very close timeline, and I'd like to also mention that submitting dissenting opinions or supplementary opinions will also be tight. We need those by May 13th so that there is enough time to prepare and have our report presented to the House on May 15th. Any comments or questions about that? Okay, seeing as there's none, we will adjourn today's meeting, and I look forward to seeing you all on May 4th for our final meeting of witnesses. Take care.